I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. I should have known better than to trust my phone's GPS, especially at night. But I was tired, annoyed, and desperate to get home after a long day at the conference. That's how I found myself on this godforsaken back road, praying I'd see a familiar landmark soon. The clock on my dashboard glowed an eerie 11:43 p.m. as I squinted at the road ahead. My headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, revealing nothing but an endless stretch of asphalt flanked by dense woods. No streetlights, no houses, not even any road signs to reassure me I was heading in the right direction. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, trying to quell the growing unease in my stomach. "Come on, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "It's just a shortcut. You'll be home soon." That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved. Another car meant I wasn't completely alone out here. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized something odd. The car behind me wasn't passing. Despite the long stretches of clear road, it just stayed a consistent distance behind me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to get a better look, but the glare from the headlights made it impossible to make out any details. Was it a cop, some local who knew these roads better than I did, or something else entirely? I shook my head, trying to dislodge the paranoid thoughts taking root. "Get a grip," I told myself firmly. "It's just another driver, probably as lost as you are." But when I made a sudden right turn onto an even narrower road, the car followed without hesitation. My heart rate kicked up a notch. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. "Okay, this is fine," I said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even if it was just my own. "They're probably just going the same way." It's a coincidence, but the prickle of unease at the back of my neck told me otherwise. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb, 55, 60, 65 miles per hour, way too fast for these winding back roads, but I didn't care. I just wanted to put some distance between me and whoever was behind me. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The headlights in my mirror grew smaller, fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath, feeling some of the tension leave my body. Then, without warning, the lights surged forward again. Whoever was driving that car had matched my speed effortlessly, closing the gap between us in seconds. "What the hell?" I gasped, my voice sounding thin and scared in the confines of my car. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call. Who? The police. I didn't even know where I was. The screen lit up, momentarily blinding me in the darkness of the car. No signal, of course. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. This was like the beginning of every horror movie I'd ever seen. Young woman, alone on a dark road, mysterious pursuer. I shook my head violently. "Stop it," I commanded myself. "This isn't a movie. This is real life. There's got to be a rational explanation." But rational explanations were getting harder to come by as the minutes stretched on. Every turn I made, the car followed. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they matched my pace perfectly. It was like some twisted game of follow the leader, and I was losing. The trees pressed in closer on either side of the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the beam of my headlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to grab me, to pull me off the road and into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. My gas gauge caught my eye, and a fresh wave of panic washed over me. The needle was hovering dangerously close to empty. How long had I been driving? It felt like hours. But a glance at the clock told me it had only been about 45 minutes since I first noticed the car behind me. I needed to find a gas station, or a town, or literally anything other than this endless stretch of road. But the GPS on my phone was useless without a signal, and I had no idea where I was or which direction I was even heading anymore. Just as I was considering pulling over and making a run for it, though the idea of stepping out of my car into the oppressive darkness made my skin crawl, I saw something that made my heart leap. Lights in the distance. Civilization, finally. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. I let out a relieved laugh, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I was safe. I could get gas, ask for directions, maybe even call the police if the car behind me was still there. I pulled into the station, tires crunching on gravel, and glanced in my rearview mirror. The headlights that had been haunting me for the past hour were nowhere to be seen. They must have continued down the road. I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the adrenaline start to ebb away. The gas station looked old and run down, with only 2 pumps and a small convenience store attached. But right now, it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I got out of my car on shaky legs, the cool night air a shock after the stuffy interior of my vehicle. As I started to fill up my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the mysterious car pull in behind me. But the road remained empty and silent. Once my tank was full, I headed into the store. A bell jangled overhead as I pushed open the door, making me jump. An old man stood behind the counter, eyeing me curiously. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a nervous laugh. "Just got a little turned around on the back roads," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You wouldn't happen to know how to get back to the highway from here, would you?" The old man's bushy eyebrows furrowed. "Highway? Ain't no highway round these parts, Miz. Where you trying to get to?" I told him the name of my town, hoping it wasn't too far. But as I spoke, I saw something change in the old man's expression. His eyes widened slightly, and he seemed to pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You came from Millbrook Way?" he asked, his voice lowered as if he was sharing a secret. I nodded, confusion and a fresh wave of unease washing over me. Is that a problem?" The old man glanced out the window, then back at me. "You see any other cars on your way here? Anyone following you?" My blood ran cold. There was a car behind me for a while, I admitted. But they didn't follow me here. "Why? What's going on?" The old man sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older. "You're not gonna like what I'm about to tell you, Miss, but you need to hear it." He gestured to a pair of rickety chairs in the corner of the store. "You might want to sit down for this." With shaking legs, I made my way over to the chairs and sank down into one. The old man followed, lowering himself into the other chair with a grunt. "Them roads you are on," he began, his voice low and serious. "They ain't natural. Been that way for oh, must be going on 50 years now." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "What do you mean, not natural?" He leaned in closer, his eyes intense. "People go missing on those roads. Lots of them, always the same story. They take a shortcut, trying to get home faster. Then they see a car following them, and then," he trailed off, shaking his head. "And then what?" I pressed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. And then they're just gone, he finished. Like they never existed. Cars found abandoned, if they're found at all. No bodies, no trace. I felt like I was going to be sick. But I'm here, I said weakly. I made it out. The old man nodded slowly. You did. And that's the real mystery, ain't it? Why some folks make it out, and others don't. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the mysterious car pulling into the lot. But there was nothing but darkness beyond the pool of light from the gas station. What do? I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. The old man stood up with a groan. You stay here till dawn, he said firmly. Them things, whatever they are, they don't come out in the daylight. I'll give you directions back to the highway once the sun's up. I nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to argue. As the old man shuffled back behind the counter, I remained in the chair, staring out into the night. I didn't know if I believed his story. It sounded crazy, like something out of a campfire tale or a horror movie. But I couldn't deny what I'd experienced out there on those dark, winding roads. As I settled in for a long night of waiting, jumping at every sound and shadow, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if I hadn't found this gas station? What if I was still out there, driving endlessly through the night, that unseen pursuer always just behind me? And the question that truly chilled me to my core: what happens to those who don't make it out? Story 2. The moment I stepped into that empty office building, I knew something was off. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed overhead, or how my footsteps echoed just a little too loudly in the vacant corridors. But I brushed it off. First night jitters, I told myself. Totally normal for a new security guard. I'd taken this job because it seemed easy enough. Patrol an empty building, make sure nothing goes wrong. Simple, right? God, I wish I'd known then how wrong I was. The lobby was eerily quiet as I settled in at the security desk. The only sound was the soft hum of computers and the occasional ping of the elevator. I flipped through the binder of protocols, trying to look busy, but my mind kept wandering. What was I even guarding here? Just a bunch of empty cubicles and conference rooms. All right, Mike, I muttered to myself, closing the binder with a snap. Time for your first round. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the stairwell. The building was only 10 stories, but it felt massive when it was empty. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as I climbed, each floor looking identical to the last. It wasn't until I reached the 5th floor that I noticed something strange. As I pushed open the stairwell door, a chill ran down my spine. Something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I swept my flashlight across the room, it hit me. One of the chairs in the nearest cubicle was pulled out, as if someone had just gotten up and left. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast empty space. No response, of course. Just the faint echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I approached the cubicle cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe the cleaning crew had moved it earlier. But as I got closer, I noticed something else. The computer on the desk was on, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. My hand shook slightly as I reached out to touch the mouse. The screen flickered to life, revealing a half-written email. The timestamp showed it had been typed just minutes ago. What the hell? I whispered, backing away from the desk. This wasn't right. The building was supposed to be empty. I radioed down to the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, this is Mike up on 5. Did anyone else come in tonight? Static crackled for a moment before a voice responded. Negative, Mike. You're the only one logged in. A bead of sweat trickled down my back. Roger that, I replied, trying to sound casual. Must have been my mistake. I finished my round as quickly as I could, practically jogging back to the stairwell. But as I reached for the door handle, something made me pause. Out of the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw movement. Just a flicker of shadow disappearing around a corner. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time. "This is security. If anyone's here, you need to identify yourself." Silence. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the pounding of my own heart. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was letting my imagination run wild. This was a secure building. There was no way anyone else could be in here. Back at the security desk, I tried to calm my nerves. I pulled up the security camera feeds, flicking through them one by one. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just empty hallways and dark offices. But then I noticed something. In the feed from the 5th floor, right where I'd been standing not 10 minutes ago, there was a figure. It was blurry and indistinct, like a shadow given form, but it was definitely there, and it was looking directly at the camera. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. When I looked back, the figure was gone. "Get a grip, Mike," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "You're seeing things." But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, set my nerves on edge. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing behind me. As the night wore on, things only got stranger. On my second round, I found a coffee mug on a desk in the marketing department, steam still rising from its surface. On the 7th floor, a printer suddenly whirred to life, spitting out page after page of blank paper. Each time, I radioed down to the front desk, and each time I got the same response. "You're the only one in the building, Mike." By 3 a.m., I was a nervous wreck. I'd triple-checked every lock, every security camera. I'd even called my supervisor, who assured me that everything was fine and I was probably just tired. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I was on my final round of the night when it happened. I was passing through the executive suite on the top floor when I heard it. Footsteps, soft but distinct, coming from the conference room at the end of the hall. My whole body went cold. This was it. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that there really was someone else in the building. I approached the conference room slowly, my flashlight beam shaking in my unsteady hand. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear something else now. The soft sound of breathing. "This is security," I called out, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "I know you're in there. Come out slowly with your hands where I can see them." No response, just that soft, rhythmic breathing. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This was stupid, I knew. I should call for backup, wait for the police. But I had to know. I had to see for myself. I threw open the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The conference room was empty. I swept the light around frantically, checking every corner, under the table, behind the curtains. Nothing, not a soul in sight. But as I turned to leave, my blood ran cold. There, on the large whiteboard at the front of the room, written in fresh red marker, were 2 words. "Behind you." I spun around so fast, I nearly fell, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam skittered across the room, illuminating a pair of feet standing in the doorway. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed like I've never screamed before. But when I blinked, the feet were gone. The doorway was empty. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I ran. I know I ended up back at the security desk, shaking and sweating, my uniform soaked through. With trembling hands, I pulled up the security footage again. I had to see it. Had to prove to myself that I wasn't going insane. I queued up the feed from the conference room, rewinding to just a few minutes ago. There I was, entering the room, sweeping my flashlight around, and there it was. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing right behind me, following my every move, always just out of my line of sight. As I watched, it raised a hand, reaching out towards me. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat at the security desk, jumping at every sound, my eyes glued to the door. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I nearly hugged him in relief. I babbled out some excuse about not feeling well and practically ran out of the building. As I stepped out into the early morning light, I gulped in the fresh air, feeling like I'd just escaped from a tomb. I called my supervisor as soon as I got home, telling him I quit. He tried to talk me out of it, but I was adamant. No job was worth what I'd experienced last night. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a shadow that shouldn't be there. In quiet moments, I think I can hear the sound of soft footsteps behind me. And every night, I dream of that empty office building, of dark corridors and flickering lights, of a figure always just out of sight, watching, waiting, following. Story 3. The rustic charm of the cottage had seemed so inviting in the Airbnb photos. Now, as I stood in the entryway, suitcase in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the musty smell that hit me as soon as I opened the door, or the way the floorboards creaked under my feet, as if protesting my presence, but I brushed it off. After all, old houses have character, right? Home sweet home for the weekend, I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice as I turned to my husband, Jake. He gave me a tired smile, lugging his own bag inside. As long as there's a bed and some peace and quiet, I'm happy. We'd been planning this getaway for months. A chance to escape the city, reconnect, maybe even start talking about starting a family. The cottage, nestled in a small town I'd never heard of before, had seemed perfect. Quaint, isolated, romantic. If only I'd known then what I know now. The first sign that something wasn't right came as we were unpacking. I was hanging up my clothes in the old wooden wardrobe when I noticed a framed photo on the dresser. It showed a family, mum, dad, 2 kids, smiling in front of the very cottage we were staying in. But something about it made my skin crawl. I picked it up for a closer look and nearly dropped it when I realized what was wrong. The faces, they'd all been scratched out, leaving blank ovals where smiles should have been. "Jake," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Can you come here a sec?" He appeared in the doorway, a quizzical look on his face. "What's up, Liz?" I held out the photo. "Did you see this? It's creepy, right?" Jake took the frame, frowning as he examined it. "Huh. Yeah, that's weird. Maybe some kid got creative with it." I shook my head. Who would leave something like this out for guests to see? It's unsettling. Jake shrugged, setting the photo face down on the dresser. Probably just an oversight. "Don't let it spoil the weekend, okay?" He pulled me into a hug, and I tried to relax into his embrace. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. As the afternoon wore on, I tried to focus on the positive. The cottage was cozy, with a fireplace in the living room and a well-equipped kitchen. We made dinner together, laughing and talking like we used to before work, and stress had started to drive a wedge between us. But as night fell, the charm of the place began to wear thin. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. Every creak and groan of the old house set my nerves on edge. "I'm going to grab some firewood," Jake said after dinner, nodding towards the fireplace. "Want to get the fire started?" I nodded, grateful for something to do. As I knelt by the fireplace, arranging kindling, I heard a thud from upstairs. I froze, listening intently. Another thud, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. "Jake," I called out, my heart racing. No answer. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The footsteps moved across the upper floor, then stopped. A door creaked open. I was halfway to the front door, ready to bolt, when Jake came in, arms full of firewood. "Whoa, where's the fire?" he joked, then frowned when he saw my face. "Liz, what's wrong? Didn't you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The noises upstairs." Jake set down the wood, his brow furrowed. "I didn't hear anything." "Are you sure it wasn't just the house settling?" I shook my head vehemently. "No, it was footsteps. I'm sure of it." Jake's expression softened. He came over and put his hands on my shoulders. "Hey, it's okay. This place is probably just a little spookier than we're used to. How about we get that fire going and watch a movie? Take your mind off things." I wanted to argue, to insist that we check upstairs, but the concern in Jake's eyes made me hesitate. Was I overreacting? Maybe the stress of the past few months was finally getting to me. "Okay," I said finally, managing a weak smile. "A movie sounds good." We curled up on the couch, the fire crackling merrily in the grate. As we scrolled through Netflix, I tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the house. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light across the room. Jake was snoring softly beside me. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor upstairs. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him gently. "Jake, wake up." He stirred, blinking at me in confusion. What's wrong?" "Listen," I hissed. We sat in silence for a moment. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. Jake sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "Okay," he said slowly. "That's not normal." I clutched his arm. "What do we do?" Jake stood up, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. "I'm going to check it out." "You stay here." "No," I said, perhaps a bit too loudly. "We should leave, now." Jake hesitated, torn between investigation and retreat. Another scrape, followed by a thud, made the decision for us. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." We grabbed our phones and car keys, not bothering with anything else. As we hurried to the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. Jake reached for the doorknob, turned it, and nothing happened. The door wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "That's impossible," I said. "We never locked it." Jake rattled the doorknob again, then threw his shoulder against the door. It didn't even shudder in its frame. The scraping sound was getting closer now, moving down the stairs. We backed away from the door, Jake positioning himself in front of me, the fireplace poker held out like a weapon. "The windows," I whispered. "We can break a window." We moved to the living room window. Jake raised the poker, ready to smash the glass. But as he swung, the poker passed right through the window, as if it wasn't there. The image of the outside world flickered like a bad TV signal. "Oh God," I breathed. "This isn't real. None of this is real." As if in response to my words, the room around us began to change. The cozy cottage interior melted away, revealing bare, concrete walls. The comfortable furniture transformed into cold metal tables and chairs. And there, descending the stairs, was a figure I recognized from the scratched-out family photo. "Welcome home," the figure said, its face a blank, featureless oval. "We've been waiting for you," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. I blinked, and suddenly I was back in the cottage living room. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. Jake was shaking me gently. Liz, wake up. You were having a nightmare." I sat up, gasping, my heart pounding. The room looked normal, cozy, safe, but the lingering terror of my dream clung to me like a cold sweat. "We need to leave," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." Jake looked concerned. "Liz, it was just a bad dream. We've got the whole weekend." "No," I cut him off. "Something's wrong here. Please, Jake, trust me." Maybe it was the desperation in my voice, or the wild look in my eyes, but Jake didn't argue. We packed quickly, leaving most of our things behind in our haste to get out. But as we drove away from the cottage, a chill ran down my spine. The road didn't look familiar. We should have reached the highway by now, but all I could see were more trees, more isolated houses. "Jake," I said slowly, "do you remember which way we came in?" He frowned, peering out the windshield. I thought I did, but nothing looks familiar. We drove for hours, taking turn after turn, but somehow always ending up back where we started. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road. And there, in the fading light, I saw it, the cottage, waiting for us. As we pulled up in front of it, defeated and terrified, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A new framed photo had appeared on the porch. A family of 4, smiling in front of the cottage. Our faces were already scratched out. Story 4. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even the crunch of gravel under my boots. Just an oppressive, all-encompassing quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. I'd been hiking these mountains for years, but I'd never encountered a trail quite like this one. I paused, taking a swig from my water bottle as I surveyed the path ahead. The trail wound its way through dense pine forest, disappearing around a bend about 50 yards ahead. According to my map, this route should lead me to a stunning viewpoint overlooking the valley. A new trail, the rangers had said, challenging, but worth it for experienced hikers. I jumped at the chance to be one of the first to explore it. Now, standing alone in that unnaturally silent forest, I was starting to regret my enthusiasm. "Come on, Mara," I muttered to myself, shouldering my pack. "You've done tougher hikes than this. It's just a new trail." But as I set off again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees seemed to press in closer here, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air felt thicker, almost syrupy, as if it was trying to slow my progress. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I first noticed the markers. Small stone cans, stacked with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. They lined the trail at regular intervals, each one exactly the same height and shape. I frowned, pulling out my trail guide. There was no mention of cairns on this route. "Huh," I said aloud, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the still air. Maybe some other hikers put these up, but something about them made my skin crawl. They were too perfect, too uniform. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It hit me suddenly, stopping me in my tracks. The cans were facing the wrong way. Instead of guiding hikers along the trail, they seemed to be pointing off into the dense underbrush. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, the sound as sharp as a gunshot in the silence. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello," I called out, wincing at how small and scared my voice sounded. "Is someone there?" No response. Just that heavy, waiting silence. I turned back to the trail, picking up my pace. The sooner I reached that viewpoint, the sooner I could head back down to civilization. But as I rounded the bend, I froze, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The trail split in two. One path continued straight ahead, marked by the official trailblazers I'd been following. The other veered off to the left, deeper into the forest. It was lined with those unsettling stone cairns, stretching as far as I could see into the gloom beneath the trees. I pulled out my map again, hands shaking slightly. There was no fork marked here, no alternate route. Just one clear path to the viewpoint. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, turning the map this way and that, as if a new path might magically appear on the paper. A gust of wind suddenly whipped through the trees, carrying with it a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper. A single word, repeated over and over. "Come." I stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over my own feet. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I needed to get out of here, to get back to my car and drive far, far away from this place. I turned to retrace my steps, only to find that the trail behind me had changed. Where there had been a clear path, there was now only dense underbrush, as if the forest had closed in behind me while I wasn't looking. Panic clawed at my throat. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked different. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching down towards me. The stone cairns had multiplied, now surrounding me on all sides, all pointing towards that second, impossible trail. "No," I said, my voice rising. No, this isn't happening." But it was. And deep down, I knew I only had one choice. With a shaky breath, I stepped onto the cairn-lined path. The moment my foot touched the dirt, the whispering intensified. It was all around me now, a chorus of voices urging me forward. "Come, come, come." I walked faster, then broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging scratches, but I didn't slow down. I just needed to find the end of this trail to get back to familiar ground. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that strange, twilight forest. But eventually, gasping for breath, I burst into a clearing. And there, in the center, stood a structure that made my heart stop. It was a tower, stretching up into the canopy and beyond, its top lost in the mist above the trees. It was made of the same stones as the cairns, stacked with that same unnerving precision. No mortar, no gaps, just stone fitted perfectly against stone. As I stared, transfixed, I noticed movement. The stones were shifting, ever so slightly, like the tower was breathing. And carved into every stone were symbols I'd never seen before, glowing with a faint, pulsing light. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come, join us, become." I backed away, shaking my head. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "No, I don't want this. I want to go home." But as I turned to flee, I found my path blocked. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their forms indistinct and shifting, like they were made of mist and shadow. They were advancing slowly, herding me towards the tower. I looked around frantically, searching for an escape route, and that's when I saw it. A gap in the ranks of the shadowy figures, a clear path back into the forest. It had to be a trap, my mind screamed, but it was my only chance. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear the whispers rising to a roar behind me, feel the brush of cold, insubstantial hands against my back. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. All I know is that suddenly, miraculously, I burst out onto a familiar trail. The normal sounds of the forest rushed back, birds chirping, leaves rustling. In the distance, I could hear voices, human voices. I stumbled towards them, tears streaming down my face. A group of hikers rounded the bend, their cheerful chatter cutting off abruptly when they saw me. "Hey, are you okay?" one of them asked, hurrying towards me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to explain, to warn them about the other trail, the tower, the whispers, but no words came out. I looked back the way I'd come, but saw only normal forest. No sign of the strange path I'd been on. Had it all been a hallucination? Some kind of panic attack brought on by getting lost? But as the hikers helped me to my feet, one of them gasped, "What happened to your pack?" I looked down and felt the blood drain from my face. My backpack, my water bottle, my trail map, all gone. And there, clutched tightly in my hand, was a single small stone, perfectly round and smooth, with a faintly glowing symbol carved into its surface. As I stared at it, I could have sworn I heard a whisper, so faint it might have been just the wind. Soon, I dropped the stone as if it had burned me, watching with a mix of relief and terror as it rolled away into the underbrush. But even as the hikers led me back to the ranger station, even as I sat in my car, hands shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, that tower was waiting, and someday, somehow, it would call me back. Because the truth is, a part of me wanted to answer that call. A part of me still does. And that, more than anything else I experienced on that impossible trail, is what truly terrifies me. Story 5. I never meant to become a voyeur. It started innocently enough, a glimpse through an uncontained window, a moment of curiosity about the new neighbors across the street. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to look away. Their lives, playing out like a silent film before my eyes, became my obsession. If only I'd known then how that fascination would twist into something far more sinister. My name is Daniel, and this is how I lost my grip on reality. It was a crisp autumn evening when they moved in. I remember because I was nursing a glass of whiskey, brooding over another failed relationship, when the moving truck pulled up. Through the gauzy curtains of my living room window, I watched as a young couple emerged from a sleek sedan. They looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Him tall and broad-shouldered, her petite with a cascade of red hair. I told myself I was just being neighborly, keeping an eye out as they lugged boxes and furniture into the house. But even then, there was a thrill in observing unnoticed, in piecing together their story from these fragments of their lives. As darkness fell, lights flickered on in their house, and I realized with a jolt that they hadn't put up any curtains. Their living room was laid bare, a stage set for my viewing pleasure. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the glass as I watched them unpack, laughing and stealing kisses between boxes. "Lucky bastard," I muttered, draining my glass. I should have gone to bed then. should have drawn my own curtains and forgotten about the happy couple across the street. Instead, I poured another drink and settled in for the show. Days passed, and I found myself spending more and more time at that window. I learned their routines, their habits. He left for work at 7:30 every morning, briefcase in hand, always pausing to kiss her goodbye. She worked from home, I gathered, often sitting at a desk by the front window, her face bathed in the glow of a computer screen. I started making up stories about them. In my mind, he was a successful lawyer, she a novelist working on her breakout book. I gave them names, James and Sarah, and imagined their conversations, their dreams, their fears. It was harmless, I told myself. Just a bit of fantasy to liven up my dull existence. But then things began to change. It started small. One morning, as James left for work, I could have sworn Sarah looked directly at me as she waved goodbye. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as paranoia. She couldn't possibly see me through my curtains, could she? But the feeling persisted. More and more often, I caught Sarah glancing towards my house, her eyes seeming to meet mine through the layers of glass and distance between us. And James began mirroring my movements. I first noticed it one evening as I was making dinner. Through the window, I saw James in his kitchen, chopping vegetables. I reached for the salt, and in perfect synchronization, so did he. I paused, spatula in hand, and watched in growing horror as James froze in the exact same position. Coincidence, I said aloud, my voice shaky. It has to be a coincidence, but it kept happening. When I sat down to watch TV, James would settle into his armchair at the same moment. When I got up for a midnight snack, I'd see his kitchen light flick on. It was as if he was a puppet, and I was unwittingly pulling the strings. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I stopped going to work, calling in sick day after day. My whole world narrowed to that window, to the lives playing out across the street. Lives that seemed increasingly tied to my own. One night, unable to sleep, I crept downstairs to my usual watching spot. The street was dark and silent, but a faint light glowed from James and Sarah's bedroom window. As my eyes adjusted, I saw them standing there, both staring directly at my house. At me, I stumbled back, heart pounding. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting to 10 before opening them again. The bedroom window was dark now, empty. Had I imagined it? Was I really going crazy? The next morning, I resolved to end this madness. I would introduce myself properly, prove to myself that James and Sarah were just normal people, not the phantoms my mind had turned them into. I showered, shaved, put on clean clothes for the first time in days. As I headed for my front door, I glanced out the window one last time. My blood ran cold. James was leaving his house, clean-shaven, dressed exactly like me. He paused at the end of his driveway, looking towards my house expectantly. My hand froze on the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to hide. But a stronger, stranger compulsion drew me forward. Like a man in a dream, I opened the door and stepped outside. James smiled as I approached, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was an exact mirror of the nervous grin I could feel stretched across my own face. "Good morning, neighbor," he said, his voice unsettlingly familiar. Had I imagined this voice for him in my head so many times that hearing it for real felt like déjà vu? "Good morning," I replied, my mouth dry. "I'm Daniel. I live across the street." "I know," James said, his smile never wavering. "We've been watching you too, Daniel. For a very long time." A chill ran through me. What do you mean? James laughed, but the sound was all wrong. Hollow, like an echo. Come now, Daniel. Surely you've realized by now, we're not your neighbors, we're you. The world seemed to tilt around me. That's not possible, I stammered. Isn't it, James? Or was it my own voice said? Think about it, Daniel. Have you ever seen us interact with anyone else? Have you ever seen us leave the house, except to mirror your own actions? I shook my head, trying to clear it. This couldn't be happening. But even as I denied it, memories flooded back. Sarah's knowing glances, James's synchronized movements, the way their lives seemed to revolve entirely around my observation. What are you? I whispered. James's form seemed to flicker, like a bad TV signal. For a moment, I saw myself standing there instead, a perfect copy down to the last detail. We're reflections, Daniel, he said, his voice now indistinguishable from my own. Echoes of your loneliness, your voyeuristic fantasies given form. You created us, shaped us with your constant watching, and now it's our turn to watch you. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as James's form melted away entirely, replaced by my doppelganger. It smiled my smile, spoke with my voice. Don't worry, Daniel. We'll take good care of your life. After all, we've had plenty of practice living it. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me began to dissolve, reality peeling away like old wallpaper. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own face, watching me with detached curiosity from the window of what used to be my home. I don't know how long I've been here, in this formless void. Time has no meaning in this place. Sometimes, if I concentrate hard enough, I can see glimpses of my old life, or rather, the life that thing is living in my place. I see it going to my job, talking to my friends, living the life I used to have. But more often, I see it standing at the window, watching, always watching. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of this non-existence, I wonder, if I created them with my watching, what might their watching create? I fear I'll have an eternity to find out. Story 6. The moment I shook Mr. Elias Blackwood's gnarled hand, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. His grip was ice cold, his smile a little too wide, a little too knowing. But I was a professional, wasn't I? Just another interview for my true crime podcast. I'd faced down convicted killers and grieving families alike. What could this frail old man possibly do to shake me? If only I'd trusted my instincts and walked away right then. Come in, Ms. Parker, Mr. Blackwood said, his voice a rasping whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I've been so looking forward to our little chat. I followed him into the house, my hand clutching my recording equipment like a lifeline. The interior was like stepping back in time. Heavy velvet drapes, ornate wallpaper, and the musty smell of old books permeating everything. Please, have a seat, he said, gesturing to an overstuffed armchair that looked like it might swallow me whole. Would you care for some tea? I shook my head, forcing a smile. No, thank you. I'd like to get started, if that's all right with you, Mr. Blackwood. He nodded, lowering himself into the chair opposite me with a grace that belied his apparent age. Of course, the Millbrook murders, wasn't it? Such a fascinating case. I set up my equipment, trying to ignore the way his eyes followed my every move. Yes, that's right. You were living in Millbrook at the time of the killings, correct, Mr. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed just a touch too sharp. Oh, I've lived in Millbrook all my life, Ms. Parker. I was there long before the killings, and I'll be here long after." Something in his tone made me pause, my finger hovering over the record button. "Mr. Blackwood, how old are you exactly?" He laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Older than I look, dear." "Much older," I pressed record, pushing down my unease. "For the record, could you state your name and your connection to the Millbrook murders?" "Certainly," he said, leaning forward slightly. "My name is Elias Blackwood, and I knew every single victim. Intimately." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what we'd discussed over the phone. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by intimately?" His eyes glittered in the dim light of the room. "I mean, Ms. Parker, that I watched them die. Every last one of them." My mouth went dry. Was this a confession? After all these years, had I stumbled onto the truth behind one of the most notorious unsolved cases in true crime history? "Mr. Blackwood," I said carefully, "are you saying that you were involved in the Millbrook murders?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh no, my dear. I didn't kill them. I merely facilitated their ends." I should have ended the interview right then, should have packed up my equipment and run for the hills. But the journalist in me, the part that had built my career on digging up the darkest secrets, couldn't resist. "Could you elaborate on that?" I asked, leaning in despite myself. Mr. Blackwood's smile grew impossibly wider. "With pleasure. You see, Ms. Parker, Millbrook has always been a special place. A place where the veil between worlds is thin. And sometimes, things slip through. Hungry things." A chill ran down my spine. This was veering into territory I hadn't expected. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure I understand." "No, I don't suppose you do," he said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "But you will. Oh yes, you will." As he spoke, I became aware of a change in the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to move in ways shadows shouldn't. And was it my imagination, or were the figures in the old paintings on the walls watching me? "You came here looking for a story, didn't you, Ms. Parker?" Mr. Blackwood continued, seemingly oblivious to the strangeness around us. "Well, I have quite a tale to tell. But I warn you, once you hear it, there's no going back." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "I'm listening." And so he began his story. He spoke of Millbrook's dark history, of rituals performed in the woods outside town, of bargains made with things that should not be. And as he talked, the room around us seemed to fade away, replaced by vivid visions of the events he described. I saw the first victim, Sally Jenkins, walking home late one night, saw the shadows coalesce behind her, taking on a form that made my mind recoil, heard her scream as it pulled her into darkness. "Stop," I gasped, but Mr. Blackwood paid no attention. The visions continued. Bill Thompson, found in his locked apartment, every drop of blood drained from his body. Maria Gonzalez, who vanished from her own backyard, leaving nothing but a single shoe behind. With each death, the shadows in the room grew darker, more substantial. I could hear whispers now, just on the edge of comprehension, promising secrets and power beyond imagination. "What is this?" I managed to choke out. "What are you doing to me?" Mr. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with an unholy light. "I'm giving you what you came for, Ms. Parker, the truth, the real story behind the Millbrook murders." But it was more than that. With each word, each horrifying vision, I could feel something changing inside me. It was as if the barrier between my mind and some vast, dark knowledge was crumbling away. "You see," Mr. Blackwood continued, his voice now echoing strangely, "the murders were never meant to stop. They were a tribute, an offering to keep the hunger at bay. But the police came, the media swarmed, and the rituals had to be put on hold. I wanted to run, to scream, to shut off my recorder and pretend none of this was happening. But I was rooted to the spot, my body no longer under my control. But now, he said, leaning in so close I could smell the decay on his breath, now it's time for the hunger to be sated once more. And you, my dear, are going to help us. The shadows surged forward, engulfing me. I felt cold tendrils wrapping around my mind, filling it with whispers of ancient, terrible knowledge. When the darkness receded, I found myself standing on the street outside Mr. Blackwood's house. My equipment was packed away neatly, and the sun was setting. How long had I been in there? I reached for my phone with shaking hands, intending to call someone, the police, my producer. But as I unlocked the screen, I saw dozens of notifications, emails, texts, voicemails, all asking the same thing. Where was the new episode? When would the interview be posted? With a sense of mounting dread, I opened my recording app. There, time-stamped from just minutes ago, was an audio file titled Millbrook Murders, The Truth Revealed. My finger hovered over the play button. Part of me screamed not to do it, to delete the file and forget this day ever happened. But a larger part, a part that pulsed with newfound power and terrible purpose, pressed play. Mr. Blackwood's voice filled my ears, but it wasn't the story he'd told me. Instead, it was a perfectly normal interview about the town's history, his memories of the time of the murders. Nothing strange, nothing supernatural, nothing true. But underneath it all, barely audible, I could hear whispers. The same whispers that now filled my mind, guiding my actions. I knew what I had to do. The episode would be uploaded tonight. Thousands would listen, would hear those whispers buried in the audio, and then the hunger would be sated once more. As I walked to my car, I caught my reflection in a window. For a moment, just a moment, I saw Mr. Blackwood's face superimposed over my own, his too wide smile stretching across my features. The next episode of my podcast would be a hit, I was certain. After all, everyone loves a good story, and I had so many new stories to tell. Story 7. The first thing you should know is that I'm not crazy. I know what I saw, what I experienced. But I also know that no one will ever believe me. How could they? I barely believe it myself, and I live through it. But I need to tell this story, to get it out of my head before it drives me insane. So here goes. This is what happened to me on that night shift, in that supposedly empty office building. My name is Alex, and until last month, I was a night security guard at Meridian Tower, one of those gleaming glass and steel skyscrapers that dominate the city skyline. It was my first week on the job, and I was still getting used to the eerie quiet of a building meant to house thousands, now empty save for me. That night started like any other. I arrived at 11 p.m., relieved the day shift guard, and settled in for my rounds. The lobby was bathed in the soft glow of emergency lights, the polished marble floors reflecting their dim radiance. My footsteps echoed off the high ceilings as I made my way to the security desk. I remember checking the monitors, rows upon rows of empty hallways and darkened offices. All clear, as usual. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, ready to start my first round of the night. The elevator ride to the top floor was always the worst part. Something about being in that small, enclosed space, rising higher and higher above the city, set my nerves on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling as the doors slid open on the 50th floor. My beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a sea of cubicles. I started my usual path, weaving between desks and checking that all was secure. It was monotonous work, but necessary, or so I thought. I was about halfway through my round when I saw it. Just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, gone almost before I registered it. I swung my flashlight around, heart suddenly pounding. "Hello," I called out, immediately feeling foolish. There was no one here. There couldn't be. But as I turned to continue my route, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the office chairs, which had been neatly tucked under a desk moments ago, was now pulled out. I approached slowly, my light trained on the chair. It was just an ordinary office chair, black mesh and plastic. But it shouldn't have moved. I reached out a trembling hand to touch it, half expecting it to be warm, as if someone had just vacated it. It was cold. I let out a shaky breath, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I'd just forgotten that this chair was already out. Maybe the night shift was starting to play tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I hurried through the rest of my round, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every shadow seemed to move. Every reflective surface held a possibility of another presence. By the time I made it back to the elevator, I was drenched in cold sweat. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of movement again, this time clearer. A figure, dark and indistinct, ducking behind a cubicle wall. The doors shut before I could get a better look, and I frantically jabbed the door open button, but it was too late. The elevator was already descending. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the hum of the elevator. I keyed my radio, my voice shaking as I spoke. "Base, this is Alex on the 50th floor. I think we might have an intruder." Static crackled for a moment before a voice responded. "Negative, Alex. All entry points are secure. No alarms have been triggered." I swallowed hard. I think I saw someone. And a chair moved. There was a pause. Then, "Alex, are you sure? The building's been empty for hours." I could hear the skepticism in their voice. And who could blame them? It did sound crazy. "I'm sure," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "Can you check the cameras?" "Roger that. Stand by." The elevator reached the lobby, and I stepped out on shaky legs. I made my way back to the security desk, eyes glued to the monitors. The 50th floor looked exactly as it should. Dark and empty. My radio crackled to life. "Alex, we've reviewed the footage. There's no sign of any intruder or movement on the 50th floor." I felt a chill run down my spine. That's not possible. "I saw, listen, kid," the voice cut me off, softer now. "First week on nights can be tough. Your mind plays tricks on you. Why don't you grab a coffee and try to relax?" I wanted to argue, to insist on what I'd seen. But I knew how it would sound, so I just mumbled an affirmative and signed off. I tried to focus on my duties, to push the incident out of my mind. But as the night wore on, strange things kept happening. I'd turn a corner to find a door open that I knew I'd closed. I'd hear footsteps echoing from empty corridors, and always, that sense of being watched. It was nearing 3 a.m. when things really went off the rails. I was doing another round, this time on the 30th floor, when all the computers in the open plan office suddenly came to life. Screens flickered on, one by one, filling the dark space with an eerie blue glow. I stood frozen, watching in horror as words began to appear on the screens. The same message, over and over. "We see you, Alex." A scream built up in my throat, but before I could release it, every screen went dark. The office was plunged back into darkness, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off walls and windows as I searched for a way out. But every turn led me to unfamiliar corridors. Every stairwell ended in locked doors. It was as if the building itself was changing, reshaping itself to keep me trapped. I ended up in a conference room on what I thought was the 40th floor, though by that point I couldn't be sure of anything. I barricaded the door with chairs and tables, then huddled in a corner, my flashlight clutched to my chest like a child's security blanket. That's when I heard it. A sound that still haunts my nightmares. It started as a low hum, barely audible, but it grew louder, resolving into words, if you could call them that. It was like 100 voices speaking at once, in a language that hurt my ears and made my head spin. The walls began to vibrate. The glass windows rattled in their frames. And then, to my horror, I saw handprints appearing on the glass. Dozens of them, pressed against the outside of the window, 40 stories up. I scrambled backwards, a scream finally tearing from my throat. The handprints multiplied, covering every inch of glass. And then, slowly, they began to push inward. The glass bowed and stretched, defying all laws of physics. I squeezed my eyes shut, curling into a ball on the floor. The voices grew louder, the pressure in the room building until I thought my head would explode. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The room was back to normal. No handprints, no bowed glass. My radio crackled, the day shift guard asking where I was. I never went back to Meridian Tower after that night. I quit on the spot, much to the confusion of my employers. They showed me the security footage, hours of me wandering aimlessly through empty corridors, talking to myself, cowering from things that weren't there. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those voices, feel the pressure building around me. And I wonder, what if I hadn't made it to sunrise? What if those things, whatever they were, had broken through? I don't work night shifts anymore. In fact, I avoid tall buildings altogether, because now I know the truth. When the sun goes down and the offices empty out, we're not as alone as we think we are. And the things that come out in the dark, they're always watching, always waiting. So the next time you're alone in an office building late at night, and you hear a strange noise or see a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run, and don't look back. Because if you do, you might just see what's really there in the darkness. And trust me, that's something you don't want to see. Story 8. The tunnel stretched before me, a gaping maw of darkness, swallowing the gleam of my headlights. I'd driven this route 1,000 times, but tonight, something felt different. The air in the subway car seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I guided the train into the inky blackness, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be my last ride. My name's Charlie, and I've been driving the Midnight Express for nearly 30 years. It's a lonely job, but I've always found a sort of peace in the rhythm of the rails, the quiet of the empty stations. Tonight, though, that familiar comfort was nowhere to be found. It started small, a flicker of movement on the edge of my vision, gone before I could focus on it. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. After all, retirement was just a week away. Maybe I was getting too old for this night owl business. The first stop came and went without incident. No passengers, as usual. Just the echo of the doors opening and closing, swallowed up by the tunnel's hungry silence. As I pulled away from the platform, I noticed something odd. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, seemed to flit across the tracks ahead. I blinked hard, leaning forward in my seat, but there was nothing there. "Get it together, old man," I muttered to myself, forcing a chuckle. But the sound died in my throat, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The next stretch of tunnels seemed to go on forever. I found myself straining to see beyond the reach of my headlights, searching for what? Another glimpse of that impossible shadow. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Control to train 237. "How's it looking out there, Charlie?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "All clear, control. Quiet night, roger that. Next stop, coming up in 2 minutes." I acknowledged the message, but something about the dispatcher's voice nagged at me. It sounded off, distorted somehow, like it was coming from much farther away than the control room. As I approached the next station, my headlights illuminated something on the platform that turned my blood to ice. A figure, standing motionless at the edge. But it was all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly but horrifyingly inhuman. I slammed on the brakes, the screech of metal on metal filling the tunnel. But when the train screeched to a halt and I looked again, the platform was empty. My hands were shaking as I opened the doors. The standard announcement played, its cheerful tone now seeming mockingly out of place. Now, arriving at the voice trailed off into static. I keyed my radio again. "Control, this is Charlie. Something strange is going on." I thought I saw more static. Then, faintly, I heard a voice. But it wasn't the dispatcher. It was low, guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. I ripped the radio from its cradle and threw it across the cab. The doors closed, and I pulled away from the station faster than regulation allowed. My heart was pounding, sweat beating on my forehead despite the chill in the air. "It's not real," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and frightened in the confined space. "You're just tired, seeing things." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Something was very, very wrong. The tunnel ahead seemed to stretch and warp, the tracks twisting in ways that should have been impossible. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the distortion remained. And then I saw them. Figures on the tracks. Dozens of them. Humanoid shapes, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. They stood motionless as the train bore down on them, their featureless faces turned towards me. I screamed, yanking hard on the emergency brake. The train shuddered and screeched, sparks flying as metal ground against metal. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for impact, but it never came. When I opened my eyes, the tracks ahead were clear. No figures, no signs of collision, just the endless, yawning darkness of the tunnel. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I dozed off? Was I hallucinating? The radio crackled again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I'd forgotten I'd thrown it. Hesitantly, I retrieved it from the floor. "Charlie, Charlie, do you copy?" It was the dispatcher again, but his voice was clearer now, tinged with concern. "I'm here," I managed to croak out. I think I need to stop. Something's not right. Negative, Charlie. You need to keep moving. Get to the next station. Do you understand?" The urgency in his voice sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "What's going on? What aren't you telling me?" Static was my only answer. With shaking hands, I released the brake and started moving again. The tunnel seemed to press in closer, the darkness more absolute than I'd ever seen it. I found myself hunched forward, straining to see beyond the beam of my headlights. That's when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just the normal sounds of the train, the whoosh of air, the clatter of wheels on tracks. But slowly, it resolved into voices. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all speaking at once in a language I didn't recognize. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, growing louder with each passing second. Through the cacophony, I heard something that made my heart stop. My name. They were saying my name. Charlie, Charlie. Join us, Charlie. No, I shouted, my voice lost in the otherworldly chorus. Leave me alone. The shadows at the edge of my vision began to move, coalescing into shapes that slithered and writhed along the walls of the tunnel. I couldn't look directly at them. My mind recoiled from their impossible geometries. The next station approached, but something was wrong. The platform was changing, warping and shifting like melting wax. And standing there, right in the center, was a figure. It looked like a man, at first glance. Tall, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. But as I drew closer, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't a man at all. Its face was blank, featureless except for a wide, lipless mouth that split its head nearly in two. As the train screeched to a halt, the thing turned its eyeless face towards me and smiled. Its mouth opened wider and wider until it seemed to unhinge like a snake's jaw, and from that gaping maw poured a stream of darkness, alive with writhing shapes and glinting eyes. I scrambled out of my seat, backing away from the doors. But there was nowhere to go. The darkness was seeping in through every crack and crevice, filling the cab with its otherworldly chill. In desperation, I lunged for the emergency override, yanking the lever to close the doors and restart the train. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a lurch that nearly threw me off my feet, the train began to move. I looked back, expecting to see that horrifying figure pursuing me. But the platform was empty, normal, as if nothing had happened. The voices had stopped. The shadows had retreated. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it wasn't over. I drove on, my knuckles white on the controls, jumping at every shadow and flicker of movement. The final station loomed ahead, and I've never been so glad to see the end of the line. As I pulled into the station, I half expected to see more of those things waiting for me. But there was only my replacement, looking concerned as I stumbled out of the cab, pale and shaking. Charlie, you okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, to warn him about what was lurking in the tunnels. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? Who would believe me? So I just shook my head, mumbling something about not feeling well. I walked out of that station on unsteady legs, emerged into the pre-dawn light, and never looked back. I retired the next day, couldn't face those tunnels again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear those whispers, feel the shadows moving at the edge of my vision, and I wonder, what's really down there in the depths beneath our feet? What's waiting in the darkness between stations? And I pray I never have to find out. Story 9. The first time I heard the noise from the attic, I brushed it off as the house settling. Old houses make weird sounds all the time, right? But as the night wore on, and those sounds grew more frequent, more deliberate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. If only I'd listened to that gut instinct. If only I'd grabbed those kids and run while I had the chance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name's Jess, and I've been babysitting for the Millers for about 6 months now. They're good people, pay well, and their kids, Ethan, 8, and Lily, 6, are sweet as can be. When Mrs. Miller called last minute, begging me to watch the kids for the night while she and her husband attended some emergency work thing, I didn't think twice about saying yes. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The Miller's house was one of those grand old Victorians, all gabled roofs and ornate trim. Beautiful, but in the fading light, it looked almost ominous. Mrs. Miller was a whirlwind of activity, throwing on earrings as she briefed me. Kids are fed, just need to get them in bed by 8:30. We'll be back late, don't wait up. Oh, and Jess. She paused, her expression suddenly serious. Don't go in the attic. We're having some work done up there, and it's not safe. Before I could ask any questions, she was gone in a flurry of perfume and clicking heels. Mr. Miller followed close behind, offering a distracted wave as he hurried to their waiting car. The house felt different as soon as the door closed behind them, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that feels like it's hiding something. I shook off the feeling and went to find the kids. They were in the living room, Ethan building an elaborate Lego structure while Lily colored quietly. Hey kiddos, I said, forcing cheer into my voice. Who's up for a movie before bed? Ethan looked up, his face oddly serious for an 8-year-old. Can we watch in your room, Jess? I don't like being downstairs at night. I frowned. Your room, you mean? And what's wrong with being downstairs? He shook his head emphatically. No, your room. The guest room. It's safer up there. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside. Kids say weird things sometimes, right? Sure, we can watch upstairs. Let's go pick out a movie. As we climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed bigger somehow, the shadows deeper. And was it my imagination, or did the temperature drop as we reached the second floor? We settled into the guest room, the kids snuggled up on either side of me as we started the movie, but neither of them seemed to be paying much attention. Ethan kept glancing at the door, while Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly I feared she might tear it. That's when I heard it. A soft thump from somewhere above us, then another. Like footsteps, but heavier, more deliberate. What was that? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan's eyes were wide with fear. It's them, he whispered. They're awake. Before I could ask who they were, another sound cut through the quiet, a long, drawn-out creak, like someone was slowly opening a door. Lily burst into tears. Make them go away, Jess, please. I pulled the kids closer, my heart pounding. It's okay, I said, not believing it for a second. It's just the house settling. Old houses make noises sometimes. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Houses don't settle with rhythmic thumps. They don't make sounds like something large and heavy being dragged across the floor. I reached for my phone, intending to call the Millers, or maybe the police. But as I unlocked the screen, my blood ran cold. No signal. The noises were getting louder now, and closer. It sounded like whatever was up there was at the top of the attic stairs, just one floor above us. We need to go, I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Let's go downstairs. And no, Ethan cried, clutching my arm. We can't go down there. They'll get us if we go down there. Who? I demanded, fear making my voice sharp. Who'll get us, Ethan? But before he could answer, a new sound filled the air. A voice, but not like any voice I'd ever heard before. It was deep, resonant, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Children," it called. The words stretched out into an inhuman growl. Come out, wherever you are." Lily screamed, burying her face in my side. Ethan was shaking so hard I could feel it through the bed. My mind raced. We couldn't stay here, but if Ethan was right, we couldn't go downstairs either. "That left, the window," I whispered. "We're going out the window." I ushered the kids off the bed, my eyes never leaving the door. The voice was getting closer, interspersed with heavy footsteps and a sound like claws scraping against wood. The window stuck at first, decades old paint sealing it shut. I threw my weight against it, wincing at the loud crack as it finally gave way. "Ethan, you first," I said, helping him onto the ledge. There was a porch roof just below, an easy drop for a kid his size. As he lowered himself down, I turned to help Lily, but she wasn't beside me anymore. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Lily," I hissed, "come here, we have to go." But she didn't move, didn't even seem to hear me. She just stood there, staring at something in the hallway that I couldn't see. I started towards her, but froze as a massive shadow fell across the doorway. Something was out there, something huge and impossibly shaped. I caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes, of teeth far too large and numerous to belong to anything human. "Found you," that terrible voice rumbled, and a hand, if you could call it that, reached for Lily. I don't remember moving. One moment I was by the window, the next I had Lily in my arms, slamming the door shut with my foot. I didn't pause to see if it would hold. I just ran for the window, Lily clinging to me like a lifeline. The drop to the porch roof was farther than I'd thought. I landed hard, pain shooting up my leg, but there was no time to worry about that. Not with the sounds of splintering wood coming from the guest room. Ethan was already on the ground, waving frantically for us to follow. I lowered Lily down to him, then swung myself over the edge, hanging by my fingertips for a heart-stopping moment before dropping to the lawn. We ran, across the lawn, down the street, not stopping until we reached the safety of streetlights and neighboring houses. Only then did I look back. The miller's house stood dark and silent, looking for all the world like any other house on the street. But I knew better now. I knew what was hiding behind those walls, in the shadows of that attic. I called the police, of course, told them everything. They searched the house, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of intruders, no evidence of anything strange in the attic. The Millers were confused, concerned. They swore up and down that the house was safe, that there was nothing to worry about. But I saw the look that passed between them when the kids refused to go back inside. A look of guilt, of fear. They moved out a week later. The house stands empty now, a for sale sign swaying gently in the front yard. Sometimes, when I drive past it late at night, I swear I can see lights moving in the attic windows. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear that voice on the wind. Come out, wherever you are. I don't babysit anymore. Can't bring myself to set foot in another strange house, to take responsibility for children who might be in danger from things I don't understand. But I often think about Ethan and Lily, wonder if they're safe, if they remember what happened that night. And I wonder, with a chill that never quite goes away, how many other houses are out there, hiding terrible secrets in their attics and basements. How many other families are living with monsters, pretending everything is normal until it's too late. So, if you're ever babysitting, and you hear strange noises from the attic, don't ignore them. Don't try to rationalize them away. Get those kids and get out. because you never know what might be waiting in the darkness, ready to come out and play. Story 10. The package arrived on a Tuesday. Just a small, nondescript brown box sitting innocently on my doorstep. I never should have opened it. But how could I have known that one impulsive online purchase would spiral into a nightmare that would consume my entire life? My name is Sarah, and this is how I learned the true cost of curiosity. It all started with a late-night browsing session. You know the kind, where you're mindlessly scrolling through obscure corners of the internet, following one link after another until you end up somewhere you never intended to be. That's how I found myself on a website called Curiosities and Oddities Emporium. The site was a mess of flashing GIFs and Comic Sans text, like something straight out of the early 2000s. But what caught my eye was an item listed simply as mystery box, one-of-a-kind artifact. The description was vague, promising a unique experience and a glimpse into the unknown. I should have known better. But it was late, I was bored, and the price was surprisingly cheap. Before I could think better of it, I'd clicked buy now and entered my shipping information. I forgot about the purchase almost immediately. So when that small brown box showed up weeks later, I was momentarily confused. Then excitement bubbled up as I remembered my impulse buy. I brought the package inside, setting it on my kitchen counter. It was lighter than I expected, and something inside shifted as I moved it. My hands trembled slightly as I cut through the packing tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of packing peanuts, was a small wooden box. It was intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to move if I looked at them too long. A tarnished brass lock held it shut, with no key in sight. As I lifted the box out, a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, frowning at the spidery handwriting. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. Are you satisfied yet? A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just marketing, right? Part of the mysterious experience I'd paid for. I set the note aside and turned my attention back to the box. The lock, upon closer inspection, wasn't actually locked. It was just an ornamental clasp. My heart raced as I flipped it open, lifting the lid with trembling fingers. Inside was nothing. The box was completely empty. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but it wasn't this. Disappointment and irritation warred within me. Had I really wasted money on an empty box? But as I moved to set it down, something caught my eye. There, etched into the bottom of the box, in tiny letters, was a web address. Curiosity overrode my better judgment. I grabbed my laptop, typing in the URL with shaky fingers. The page that loaded was blank, except for a blinking cursor and the words, "What do you seek?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was stupid, right? Probably just some elaborate prank, but I typed. The truth. The screen went black for a moment, then filled with text. It was an email confirmation, thanking me for my order and providing a tracking number. But I hadn't ordered anything else. Confused, I opened my email, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was. An order confirmation from Verity Ventures. The item description simply read, "Truth Serum. Use with caution." My mouth went dry. This had to be a joke, right? There was no such thing as truth serum, was there? Before I could think better of it, I clicked the tracking number. To my shock, it showed the package was already out for delivery. How was that possible? I'd just placed the order moments ago. A knock at the door made me jump. Heart pounding, I approached the front door. Through the peephole, I could see a delivery person holding a small package. With shaking hands, I opened the door. The delivery person smiled blandly, holding out a tablet for me to sign. As I scribbled my signature, I couldn't help but notice how blank their expression was, like there was nothing behind their eyes. They handed me the package and turned away without a word. I watched them walk to their truck, their movements stiff and robotic. Back inside, I stared at the new package. It was identical to the first one. Same size, same brown paper. This time, I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. A note was wrapped around it, the same spidery handwriting as before. The truth will set you free. But first, it will shatter everything you thought you knew. Drink if you dare. I set the vial down, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. And even if it was, I couldn't possibly drink some unknown substance sent by a mysterious website. That would be insane. But as the day wore on, I found my eyes drawn back to that innocent-looking vial again and again. What if it was real? What truths could it reveal? By nightfall, my resolve had crumbled. With trembling hands, I uncorked the vial and, before I could talk myself out of it, downed the contents in one gulp. It tasted like nothing. For a moment, I felt foolish. Of course it was fake. What had I been thinking? Then the room began to spin. Colors became too bright, sounds too sharp. I stumbled to my couch, collapsing as the world kaleidoscoped around me. When I came to, everything looked different, sharper somehow, more real than real. And I could hear everything. The hum of electricity in the walls, the whisper of air molecules colliding, the thunderous beat of my own heart. But worse than that were the voices. Whispers at first, then a cacophony of sound. It took me a moment to realize I was hearing thoughts. Not just my own, but those of everyone around me. My neighbors, passers-by, on the street, everyone within a growing radius. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the mental noise. Fragments of thoughts, fears, desires, secrets. They all poured into my mind in an overwhelming flood. Can't let them find out. If only she knew how I really felt. The bodies are buried deep. They'll never. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. But the voices only grew louder, more insistent. And with them came knowledge. Terrible, world-shattering knowledge. I saw the lies that held society together, the dark truths lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Government conspiracies, hidden alien encounters, the true nature of reality itself. It all poured into my mind in a torrent of information I was never meant to know. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning as I huddled on my couch, overwhelmed by the weight of the world's secrets. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I found my apartment filled with a soft, pulsing light. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from me. My skin was glowing, veins visible as rivers of light beneath the surface. A movement caught my eye, and I turned to see the wooden box from the first package sitting on my coffee table. Had I put it there? I couldn't remember. As I watched, the intricate carvings began to move, swirling and reshaping themselves. They formed words, a message just for me. The truth has found you. What will you do with it? I stared at the words, my mind reeling. What could I do? How could I possibly go back to normal life, knowing what I now knew? A new voice cut through the chaos in my mind, clearer and more insistent than the others. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the box itself. You've taken the first step, it said, its voice like silk and sandpaper all at once. But the journey has only just begun. Are you ready to go deeper? I wanted to say no. wanted to smash the box, flush the remaining liquid, forget any of this had ever happened. But the truth, once known, can't be unknown. And some part of me, some deep, primal part, craved more. With shaking hands, I reached for the box. As my fingers brushed its surface, the world around me began to dissolve. Reality peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing something vast and terrifying beyond. I'd wanted the truth. Now, for better or worse, I was about to get it, all of it. As consciousness slipped away, one last thought echoed through my mind. Curiosity killed the cat. But what does it do to humans who peer too deeply into the abyss? I fear I'm about to find out. Story 11. The last bus of the night rolled to a stop in front of me, its brakes squealing in protest. As the doors hissed open, I hesitated. Something about the shadowy interior made my skin crawl. But it was late, I was tired, and this was my only way home. Little did I know, as I climbed those 3 worn steps, that I was boarding a journey into nightmare. My name is Tom, and this is the story of the night bus that never reached its destination. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting more shadows than illumination. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed there were only a handful of other passengers scattered throughout the bus. An old woman clutching a bag to her chest, a man in a rumpled suit staring out the window, a teenager with headphones on, head bobbing to an unheard beat. "Where to?" the driver grunted, not turning to look at me. "Millbrook," I replied, fishing out my fare. "Last stop, right." He nodded curtly, accepting my money without a word. As I moved past him, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wrong somehow. Too dark, too empty. I shook off the uneasy feeling and made my way down the aisle, settling into a seat about halfway back. The bus lurched into motion, the familiar streets of the city sliding past the grimy windows. At first, everything seemed normal, just another late-night bus ride. But as we left the city limits, heading into the more rural outskirts, I began to notice things. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. The teenager's head was still bobbing, but there was no sound coming from his headphones. The old woman's grip on her bag never loosened, her knuckles white with the strain. And the man in the suit. He hadn't blinked once since I'd boarded. I tried to focus on the view outside, but the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. The familiar landmarks I expected to see never materialized. Instead, the landscape became increasingly unfamiliar, fog rolling in to obscure what little I could make out. The bus made its first stop about 20 minutes into the journey. The doors opened with that same hiss, but no one got off. Instead, a new passenger boarded. My breath caught in my throat as I saw him. He was tall, impossibly tall, having to duck to clear the doorway. His face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his gaze sweeping over the bus. He moved down the aisle with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his size. As he passed my seat, I caught a whiff of something off, like damp earth and decay. The new passenger settled into a seat at the very back of the bus. I resisted the urge to turn and look, keeping my eyes fixed firmly ahead. But I could feel his presence, a weight pressing down on the entire bus. As we continued on, more passengers boarded at stops I didn't recognize, each one stranger than the last. A woman whose skin seemed to shimmer and shift in the dim light. A child with eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. An elderly man who moved with the spryness of youth, his laugh like breaking glass. With each new arrival, the air in the bus grew thicker, harder to breathe. The other original passengers remained motionless, like mannequins posed in a macabre display. I wanted to say something, to ask the driver where we were going, why we weren't following the usual route. But every time I opened my mouth, the words died in my throat. It was as if speaking would somehow make this nightmare real, undeniable. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch insisted it had only been 45 minutes since I'd boarded. The world outside the windows had become a featureless void, not even the faintest glimmer of light visible. Then, without warning, the bus jerked to a halt. The sudden stop sent me lurching forward, my forehead nearly colliding with the seat in front of me. "Last stop," the driver called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Everybody off." My heart pounded as I realized this couldn't possibly be Millbrook. We weren't anywhere near my town. But as the other passengers began to rise, moving with eerie synchronicity, I found myself standing too, as if pulled by invisible strings. The doors opened, and a blast of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something ancient and wild. As I shuffled forward with the others, I caught my first glimpse of where we had stopped. It was a clearing in a dense forest, the trees looming impossibly tall, their branches intertwining to block out the sky. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, like a primitive altar or a tomb. Symbols I didn't recognize were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with an inner light. The passengers filed off the bus, forming a circle around the stone structure. I tried to hang back, to stay on the bus, but my feet carried me forward against my will. As I stepped off the bus, the driver finally turned to look at me. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all. He smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Welcome home," he said, his voice resonating with inhuman depths. I opened my mouth to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came out. The circle of passengers began to move, a slow, shuffling dance around the altar. And to my horror, I found myself joining in, my body moving of its own accord. As we circled, the symbols on the altar began to glow brighter. The air shimmered, reality itself seeming to warp and bend. And from the center of the altar, something began to rise. It was shapeless at first. A roiling mass of darkness shot through with flashes of otherworldly light. But as it grew, it began to take form. Limbs sprouted, too many to count. Eyes opened, blinking in sequence, each one a different color, a different shape. A mouth gaped open, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. The being, for I couldn't think of it as anything else, towered over us, its form constantly shifting and changing. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of whispers and screams. "The offering has arrived," it intoned. "The bargain will be fulfilled." Terror clawed at my throat as I realized what was happening. We weren't passengers, we were sacrifices. Just as the thought formed, the dance stopped. As one, the other passengers turned to face me. Their faces were blank, expressionless, but their eyes were alive with a hungry light. They began to advance, herding me towards the altar and the monstrosity that hovered above it. I tried to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was a puppet, my strings being pulled by some unseen force. As they pressed me back against the cold stone of the altar, I managed to find my voice at last. "Why?" I croaked out. "Why me?" The bus driver stepped forward, his form flickering and changing until he no longer looked human at all. "Because you got on the bus," he said simply. "You chose this journey." "I didn't know," I protested weakly. "I didn't understand." He smiled again, that too sharp grin splitting his face. "Ignorance is no protection against fate. You sought a ride home, and home you shall go. Just not the one you expected. The being above the altar reached for me with appendages I couldn't begin to describe, as they wrapped around me, cold and burning at the same time. I felt myself beginning to unravel. My very essence was being pulled apart, absorbed into the creature's vast, incomprehensible form. With my last moments of consciousness, I saw the bus driver turn away, climbing back into his vehicle. New passengers were already lining up to board, their eyes vacant, unaware of what awaited them. As darkness claimed me, one final thought echoed through my fading mind. Always check your route before you board. You never know where the night bus might really be going. And somewhere in the vastness beyond reality, a journey that began with a simple bus ride continues eternally, carrying me further and further from anything I once knew as home. Story 12. The moment I walked into my first gallery opening, I felt like I'd finally made it. The stark white walls were adorned with my paintings, each one a piece of my soul laid bare for the world to see. But as the night wore on, a creeping sense of unease began to take hold. Something was off. If only I'd known then that my art was about to take on a life of its own, quite literally. My name is Olivia Chen, and this is the story of how my debut exhibition became a waking nightmare. The gallery was buzzing with the low hum of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. I stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a smile that grew more strained by the minute. My gallerist, Marion, had outdone herself with the turnout. Art critics, collectors, and fellow artists milled about, their eyes roving over my work. "Olivia, darling." Marion's voice cut through the chatter as she approached, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit in tow. "You simply must meet Mr. Blackwood. He's absolutely smitten with your work." I shook Mr. Blackwood's hand, suppressing a shiver at how cold his grip was. His eyes, an unsettling pale blue, seemed to look right through me. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Your paintings are remarkable. So full of life." "Thank you," I replied, trying to ignore the way my skin crawled under his gaze. "I'm glad you're enjoying the exhibition." He smiled, revealing teeth that seemed just a touch too sharp. "Oh, I am. Particularly that piece." He gestured to a large canvas across the room. A swirl of dark colors with a vaguely humanoid shape emerging from the chaos. "It speaks to me." I nodded, remembering the feverish night I'd painted that piece. I'd woken up the next morning with no memory of creating it, my hands stained with paint and my studio in disarray. As Mr. Blackwood moved away to examine the painting more closely, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I looked down to see a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, staring up at me with wide eyes. "Your pictures are moving," she said, matter-of-factly. I crouched down to her level, forcing a laugh. "That's very kind of you to say. Art should make you feel like it's alive." She shook her head emphatically. "No, they're really moving. Look." Before I could respond, a woman, presumably her mother, hurried over. "Emma, don't bother the nice artist." "I'm so sorry," she said to me, ushering the protesting child away. I straightened up, my forced smile faltering. Kids and their imaginations, right? But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Every time I glanced at one of my paintings, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement. A brushstroke that wasn't quite where I remembered putting it. A shadow that seemed to deepen when I wasn't looking directly at it. I tried to focus on mingling, on answering questions about my process and inspiration, but my eyes kept being drawn back to my work, a sense of unease growing with each passing moment. It was during a conversation with a particularly pompous art critic that I saw it happen. Over his shoulder, I watched as the figure in one of my abstract pieces slowly turned its head, its blank face now staring directly at me. I choked on my champagne, coughing and spluttering. The critic looked affronted, but I barely noticed as I pushed past him, moving closer to the painting. It was still, motionless, exactly as I'd painted it. "Are you all right, Ms. Chen?" Mr. Blackwood's voice made me jump. He'd appeared beside me without a sound, those unsettling eyes fixed on my face. "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice shook. "Just thought I saw something." His smile widened. "Ah, yes. Your work does have a way of coming to life, doesn't it?" Before I could respond, Marion was at my elbow, pulling me away to meet another potential buyer. But as I glanced back, I could have sworn I saw Mr. Blackwood reaching out to touch the canvas, his fingers sinking into the paint as if it were liquid. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled, I chatted, I explained my art to people who nodded as if they understood. But all the while, I could feel my paintings watching me. Their colors seemed more vivid, their shapes more defined. And in the corner of my eye, I kept seeing movement. A hand reaching out from a frame, a face turning to follow me as I walked by. As the last of the guests filed out, Marion was ecstatic. "Darling, you've done it. Nearly every piece sold. Mr. Blackwood alone bought half the collection." I nodded numbly, my eyes drawn to the paintings that remained. They seemed to pulse with an inner light, the brushstrokes writhing like living things. "Olivia," Marion's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right? You look pale." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, a strangled gasp escaped my lips as I watched in horror as the central figure in my largest painting, the one Mr. Blackwood had admired, began to push its way out of the canvas. Paint dripped onto the pristine gallery floor as a hand, then an arm, then a shoulder emerged. The figure's face was a swirl of colors, its features constantly shifting and reforming. Marion screamed, the sound snapping me out of my trance. I grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the exit, but our path was blocked. The other paintings were coming to life too, their inhabitants stepping out of their frames with slow, deliberate movements. We backed away, pressing ourselves against the far wall. The creatures, for I couldn't think of them as paintings anymore, advanced. Their bodies were a riot of color and texture, paint dripping from them like blood. "What's happening?" Marion whimpered. "Olivia, what are they?" I shook my head, words failing me. These were my creations, born from my imagination, my nightmares, my deepest fears and desires. And now they were here, in the flesh, or whatever passed for flesh for beings made of paint and canvas. The largest figure, the one from Mr. Blackwood's favorite painting, reached us first. It loomed over me, its face a swirling vortex of dark colors. When it spoke, its voice was like wet paint splattering on canvas. "Creator," it gurgled. "You gave us form. You gave us life. Now we are free." "I didn't mean to," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I didn't know." The creature's head tilted, an eerily human gesture. "Intent is irrelevant. We exist, and now we hunger." It reached for me with hands that were more like claws, dripping with still wet paint. I closed my eyes, bracing for, I don't know what, death, absorption, transformation. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a familiar voice, smooth as silk and cold as ice. Now, Mr. Blackwood said, stepping out of the shadows. "Is that any way to treat your creator?" The creatures turned as one, their attention drawn to the newcomer. Mr. Blackwood stood calmly amidst the chaos, a small smile playing on his lips. "You," the lead creature growled. "You are not the creator." Mr. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing those two sharp teeth. "No, but I am a collector. And you, my dear things, are now mine." He snapped his fingers, and reality seemed to twist. The air shimmered, and suddenly we were no longer in the gallery. We were somewhere else, somewhere dark and vast. I could hear screams and whispers, see flashes of other artwork, paintings, sculptures, things I couldn't begin to describe. All around us. "Welcome, Mr. Blackwood said, his form shifting, growing, becoming something inhuman, to my true gallery. As consciousness began to fade, my last sight was of my creations being absorbed into this new, horrifying canvas. And my last thought was a desperate wish that I'd chosen a different career. Anything but art. When I awoke, I was back in the gallery. Marion was shaking me, concern etched on her face. The paintings hung innocently on the walls, showing no signs of the nightmare I'd just experienced. "Olivia, are you okay?" "You fainted," I nodded shakily, getting to my feet. But as I looked around the gallery, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. Every single painting was gone. Sold, Marion told me excitedly, to various collectors, but mostly to Mr. Blackwood. As I left the gallery that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in some impossible space, my creations were still alive, still watching, still hungry. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that my days as an artist were over. Some things, once created, can never truly be controlled. And some galleries, once entered, can never truly be left. Story 13. The first crack appeared on the third day of our camping trip. A thin, jagged line etched into the bark of an ancient oak, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. I wish I'd never seen it. I wish we'd packed up and left right then. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and in the depths of those woods, it became our undoing. My name is Jake, and this is the story of how a simple camping trip turned into a fight for survival against something we never should have disturbed. It was supposed to be a fun getaway. Just me, my girlfriend Lily, and our friends Mike and Sarah. A long weekend in the wilderness, away from the noise and stress of the city. We'd found this spot online, advertised as a hidden gem for experienced campers looking for true isolation. No designated campgrounds, no ranger stations, just pure, untamed nature. The first 2 days were pretty much perfect. We hiked, swam in a crystal clear lake, and spent our nights around the campfire, sharing stories and looking up at more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. It was on the morning of the third day that things started to get weird. I was the first one up, tending to the embers of last night's fire, when I noticed something odd about the big oak tree at the edge of our clearing. There was a mark on it that I could have sworn wasn't there before. I walked over to investigate, running my fingers along the strange crack in the bark. "What you're looking at?" Lily's voice made me jump. She'd come up behind me, sleep still clouding her eyes. "This crack," I said, gesturing to the tree. "Was this here yesterday?" Lily peered at it, frowning slightly. "I don't think so. Weird. Maybe the heat made the bark split." I shrugged, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Yeah, probably." But as the day wore on, I kept finding myself glancing back at that tree, and each time I looked, I could have sworn the crack was just a little bit wider, a little bit deeper. By midday, Mike and Sarah had noticed it too. We stood around the tree, all four of us, staring at the now unmistakable fissure running from roots to branches. "We should leave," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with barely contained panic. "This isn't right," Mike laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, it's just a tree. Probably got hit by lightning or something." But even as he said it, we watched in horrified fascination as the crack widened before our eyes, a groaning sound emanating from deep within the trunk. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe Sarah's right. Let's pack up," and I was cut off by a sound that still haunts my nightmares. A high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We clapped our hands over our ears, but it did nothing to block out the otherworldly shriek. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Small at first, barely noticeable, but quickly growing in intensity, until we could barely keep our balance. "Earthquake?" Lily suggested, her voice shaking as much as the earth. But this was no earthquake. As we watched, paralyzed with fear, the crack in the tree began to glow. A sickly, pulsing light emanated from within, casting long, twisted shadows across our campsite. And then, to our horror, something began to emerge from the fissure. It was wrong. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. A writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, oozing out of the tree like some kind of cosmic afterbirth. The air filled with a smell like rotting meat and ozone, so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah screamed. That seemed to break the spell holding us in place. We ran, abandoning our campsite and plunging into the woods with no thought but escape. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green twilight beneath the canopy. But eventually, gasping for breath, we stumbled to a stop in a small clearing. What was that thing? Lily panted, clutching a stitch in her side. Nobody had an answer. We all just stood there, trying to catch our breath and process what we'd seen. That's when we realized our mistake. In our panic, we'd run blindly into the forest. Now, looking around, I realized with growing dread that I had no idea which direction we'd come from. "Guys," I said slowly, "I think we're lost." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lost in a forest that suddenly felt a lot bigger and a lot more dangerous than it had just hours ago. We tried to retrace our steps, but it was useless. Every tree looked the same, every path circling back on itself. And all the while, we could feel something. Watching, waiting. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Not the usual chorus of insects and nocturnal animals, but something else. Whispers just on the edge of hearing. Movements glimpsed from the corner of the eye. We huddled together in a small hollow, too terrified to light a fire for fear of attracting attention. The darkness pressed in around us, alive and hungry. "Look," Sarah suddenly hissed, pointing with a shaking finger. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, I noticed a faint glow between the trees. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a campfire, or a ranger with a flashlight. But as the light grew closer, that hope turned to icy dread. It was the same sickly glow we'd seen emanating from the tree. And it was moving with purpose, weaving between the trunks with an unnatural grace. We pressed ourselves deeper into the hollow, hardly daring to breathe. The light paused at the edge of our hiding spot, hovering there for what felt like an eternity. I could feel its attention. There's no other word for it. It knew we were there. Just when I thought my heart might explode from the tension, the light moved on, disappearing back into the depths of the forest. We waited until dawn before daring to move. The forest looked different in the pale morning light. Older, somehow. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. And everywhere we looked, we saw those cracks. Thin fissures running through tree trunks, rocks, even the very ground beneath our feet. All pulsing with that faint, sickly light. "We have to get out of here," Mike said, his voice hoarse. Now we picked a direction and started walking, hoping against hope that we'd eventually hit a road, a trail, anything that would lead us back to civilization. But with each step, the forest seemed to close in around us. Paths that looked promising would suddenly end in sheer rock faces. Clearings we could have sworn we'd never seen before appeared, disorienting us further. And all the while, those cracks kept appearing. Larger now, some wide enough to stick a hand into. None of us dared to get close enough to look inside. It was near sunset when we heard it again. That keening wail that had started it all. Louder this time, and closer. Much closer. We ran, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots seemed to reach up to trip us. But we didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I don't know how long we ran, or how we finally found our way out. Those last hours in the forest are a blur of terror and confusion. But somehow, miraculously, we burst out onto a road just as night was falling. A passing motorist found us, dirty, bleeding, and babbling about monsters in the woods. They called the police, who called search and rescue. Our story was met with skepticism, of course. They put it down to hallucinations brought on by eating the wrong kind of mushrooms or something. But I know what we saw, what we experienced, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that wail again, carried on the wind. And in the trees outside my window, in the cracks in the sidewalk, I catch glimpses of that sickly, pulsing light. We woke something up in those woods, something old and hungry and patient, and I can't shake the feeling that one day those cracks are going to spread. That whatever came out of that tree is still out there, growing stronger, waiting for its chance to break through into our world. So if you're ever camping and you see a strange crack in a tree, run, and don't look back, because some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Story 14. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, and I couldn't help but grin. My very own apartment, in the heart of the city, at a price that seemed too good to be true. As I stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings filled my nostrils. If only I'd known then that some deals come with hidden costs, and that my dream home was about to become a waking nightmare. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how my perfect apartment turned into a prison of paranoia and terror. The first few days were bliss. I spent hours arranging my furniture, hanging artwork, and generally nesting in my new space. The apartment was everything I'd hoped for. Spacious, with lots of natural light and a view of the city skyline that took my breath away. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed something off. I was settling in for bed when I caught a whiff of something strange. A musty, almost metallic scent that seemed to be coming from the air vents. I made a mental note to mention it to the building manager in the morning and tried to ignore it as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the smell was gone, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But as I was getting ready for work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The photo of my family that I'd placed on my bedside table was now on my dresser. I stood there, staring at it, trying to remember if I'd moved it myself. But I was certain I hadn't. With shaking hands, I picked up the frame, examining it closely. That's when I noticed the smudge on the glass. A perfect fingerprint that definitely wasn't mine. "Get a grip, Emma," I muttered to myself, setting the photo back down. "You probably moved it without thinking. New place, new routines. It's fine." But as I left for work, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. That evening, I came home to find my neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering amongst themselves. Mrs. Chen from across the hall spotted me first. "Oh, Emma dear," she said, her lined face creased with concern. "We were just talking about you. Have you noticed anything strange in your apartment?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, strange?" The others exchanged glances before Mr. Patel from 4B spoke up. "Things moving on their own. Weird noises. Smells that shouldn't be there." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell them they were being ridiculous. But the image of that misplaced photo flashed through my mind. Maybe, I admitted. But it's probably nothing, right? Old buildings make noises. Mrs. Chen patted my arm sympathetically. "Of course, dear. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Just be careful, okay?" As I unlocked my door, I could feel their eyes on me, filled with a mixture of pity and fear. Inside, everything looked normal. But now that seed of doubt had been planted, I found myself scrutinizing every shadow, every slight creak of the floorboards. I tried to go about my evening as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I was making dinner, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in my peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens from the street below, the whisper of wind through the air vents. Just as I was finally drifting off, a loud thud jolted me awake. It had come from the living room. Heart pounding, I reached for my phone, using its flashlight as I crept out of bed. The living room was bathed in moonlight, everything cast in shades of silver and shadow. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Then I saw it. My favorite vase, a housewarming gift from my mother, lay shattered on the floor. But it wasn't the broken vase that made my blood run cold. It was the wet footprints leading away from the mess, disappearing into the kitchen. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Run? As if, in answer to my unspoken questions, a floorboard creaked in the kitchen. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. But as I finally got the door open and stumbled into the hallway, I was met with only darkness. The lights that usually illuminated the corridor were out, leaving me in pitch blackness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there? I need help." No response. Just the echo of my own frightened voice bouncing off the walls. I felt my way along the wall, searching for the stairwell. But something was wrong. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the familiar doors of my neighbors nowhere to be found. After what felt like hours, I finally found a door. Relief flooded through me as I turned the handle and pushed it open, only to find myself back in my own apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, down to the shattered vase on the floor. But now, in the center of the room, stood a figure. It was turned away from me, its form indistinct in the moonlight. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. "What do you want?" The figure turned, slowly. And as it did, I felt my grip on reality begin to slip. Because the face looking back at me was my own. But wrong, distorted. Its eyes were too large, its smile too wide, stretching impossibly across its face. "Welcome home, Emma," it said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "We've been waiting for you," I screamed, turning to run. But the door behind me was gone, replaced by a solid wall. I was trapped. The thing that looked like me, but wasn't, began to move towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it approached, its form began to shift and change, growing larger, more monstrous. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, this would all be a nightmare. But when I looked again, the creature was still there, now looming over me, its breath hot on my face. "What are you?" I whispered, pressing myself against the wall. It laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We are the keepers of this place, the guardians of the spaces between. And you, Emma, have been chosen." Before I could react, it reached out, its hand passing through my chest, as if I were made of smoke. I felt a tugging sensation, as if something essential was being pulled out of me. I gasped, the world spinning around me. As consciousness began to fade, I saw my body crumple to the floor, but I was still standing, transparent and ethereal. The creature smiled, its form melting away to reveal my own face once more. But now it was solid, real, while I was nothing more than a ghost. "Thank you for the gift of flesh," it said, examining my hands with fascination. "We've been waiting so long for a suitable host." "No," I tried to say, but no sound came out. I was fading, becoming less substantial with each passing moment. The thing wearing my face walked to the door, which had reappeared. It paused, looking back at me with a pitying smile. "Don't worry, Emma. We'll take good care of your life. And who knows, maybe the next tenant will set you free." With that, it walked out, closing the door behind it. I tried to follow, but I couldn't seem to move. I was anchored here, in this apartment that had become my prison. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has little meaning in this spectral form. I watch as new tenants come and go, each staying for shorter periods as they sense the wrongness of this place. I try to warn them, to communicate somehow, but it's useless. I'm nothing more than a cold spot, a fleeting shadow in the corner of their eye. And always, I feel the presence of the others, the trapped souls of previous tenants, their whispers, a constant background noise in this liminal space. So if you're ever apartment hunting, and you find a place that seems too good to be true, perfect location, unbelievable price, think twice, look closely at the landlord, at your neighbors. And if something feels off, trust your instincts and walk away, because some apartments come with hidden costs, and some leases, once signed, can never be broken. Story 15. The moon hung low and full over the water, its reflection rippling across the surface like a portal to another world. I'd come to this secluded beach for a late-night swim, seeking solitude and a break from the summer heat. But as I waded into the inky black water, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the depths. If only I'd listened to that nagging voice in my head telling me to turn back. Maybe then I wouldn't be trapped in this nightmare, forever chasing a shore that seems to drift further away with each desperate stroke. My name is Alex, and this is the story of how a simple night swim turned into a battle for survival against forces I still can't fully comprehend. The sand was still warm beneath my feet as I made my way down to the water's edge. The beach was deserted, just as I'd hoped. No rowdy teenagers, no couples seeking a romantic moonlit stroll. Just me and the vast, dark ocean stretching out to the horizon. I stripped down to my swim trunks, leaving my clothes and phone in a neat pile well above the tide line. The first touch of water on my toes sent a shiver up my spine. Not from cold, but from a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. I hesitated for a moment, considering heading back to my car and forgetting this whole idea. But the heat was oppressive, and the water looked so inviting. I pushed the feeling aside and waded in deeper. The ocean enveloped me like silk, cool and soothing against my skin. I ducked under, relishing the quiet underwater world. When I surfaced, I noticed something odd. The water around me seemed to be glowing. Faint patterns of blue-green light swirled and eddied with each movement of my arms. Bioluminescence, I murmured to myself, fascinated. I'd heard about this phenomenon but never seen it in person. Each sweep of my hand left trails of ethereal light in the water. I swam further out, marveling at the way the glowing patterns seemed to follow me. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and deeply unsettling, because the longer I watched, the more I realized that the patterns weren't random. They were forming shapes, curves and spirals that almost looked like writing. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the water temperature. I turned back toward shore, suddenly eager to be on dry land. But as I started swimming, I realized something was wrong. The beach seemed much further away than it should have been. The lights from the parking lot, tiny pinpricks in the distance. Had I really swum out that far without noticing? I picked up my pace, powerful strokes cutting through the water. But after several minutes of hard swimming, the shore didn't seem any closer. If anything, it looked even further away. Panic began to set in. I treaded water, trying to get my bearings. That's when I felt it, something brush against my leg. I jerked away instinctively, heart pounding. Probably just seaweed, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The touch had been too solid, too deliberate. I started swimming again, no longer caring about form or efficiency, just desperate to reach the shore. The bioluminescent patterns around me grew brighter, more agitated. They seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. Another touch, this time against my arm. I couldn't hold back a yelp of fear. I thrashed in the water, trying to see what was down there. But the glow from the bioluminescence only illuminated a few feet around me, leaving the depths an impenetrable darkness. "Help!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and frightened in the vast emptiness around me. Somebody help me. But there was no one to hear. No one except whatever was circling beneath me, drawing ever closer. The glowing patterns in the water began to coalesce, forming a ring around me. As I watched in horror, they started to rise, taking on three-dimensional form. Tendrils of living light reached toward me, their touch electric and alien. I tried to swim through them, but they parted around me like smoke, reforming in my wake. It was like being trapped in a cage of light, one that was slowly constricting around me. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through the water, through my very bones, and within that hum I could almost make out words, an language older than time, speaking directly into my mind. "Join us," it seemed to say. "Become one with the depths." The tendrils of light wrapped around my arms and legs, their touch no longer electric but burning. I screamed, the sound lost in the all-encompassing hum. I could feel myself being pulled down, the surface of the water receding above me. In desperation, I took one last huge breath before I was yanked beneath the waves. The underwater world was a nightmare of light and shadow. Enormous shapes moved in the darkness beyond the bioluminescent glow, things with too many limbs and eyes that shone like dying stars. I struggled against the tendrils holding me, my lungs burning for air. But for every one I managed to break free from, two more took its place. I was being drawn deeper and deeper, the pressure building in my ears. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, just as I was about to give in and breathe in the deadly seawater, everything stopped. The tendrils released me, dissipating into the water like smoke. The huge shapes retreated, melting back into the darkness. For a moment, I floated there in confusion. Then my survival instincts kicked in, and I started swimming for the surface. My head broke the water, and I gasped in huge lungfuls of air, coughing and sputtering. But as my vision cleared and I looked around, my relief turned to ashes. The shore was gone. In every direction, as far as I could see, there was nothing but open ocean. The moon hung impossibly large in the sky, its light cold and unforgiving. I spun in a slow circle, desperate for any sign of land, of rescue. There was nothing, just endless water and that massive, mocking moon. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "It can't be real." As if in answer, the water around me began to glow again. But this time, instead of abstract patterns, it formed words. Actual English words, written in light across the surface of the ocean. Reality is relative here. I squeezed my eyes shut, sure that when I opened them again, I'd be back on the beach, that this would all have been some vivid hallucination. But when I looked again, the words were still there, rippling gently with the motion of the waves. New words began to form. "You are ours now." "Forever? No," I whispered, tears mixing with the salt water on my face. "Please, no." But even as I pleaded, I knew it was useless. Whatever forces ruled this impossible ocean, they had no interest in mercy. I was trapped in a world where the normal rules of reality no longer applied, where distance and time had no meaning. I don't know how long I've been swimming now. Hours, days, years. The moon never sets. The sun never rises. Sometimes I see things on the horizon. Ships, islands, even entire cities. But no matter how hard I swim towards them, they never get any closer. The bioluminescent creatures are my constant companions, their light both beautiful and terrifying. Sometimes they form images from my memories, faces of loved ones, places I used to know. Other times they show me wonders and horrors from the depths that no human was ever meant to see. And always, always, I hear that humming, that ancient voice calling me to give up, to sink beneath the waves and become one with this alien sea. I don't know if I'm still human anymore. My body doesn't tire, doesn't hunger. I'm not even sure if I'm still breathing or if I've somehow adapted to this impossible environment. All I know is that I keep swimming, because the alternative, giving in to whatever lurks in the depths, is too terrifying to contemplate. So if you're ever tempted by a late-night swim in a secluded spot, think twice. Because some waters, once entered, can never truly be left. And some depths, once glimpsed, will haunt you for eternity. Story 16. I never should have taken that red-eye flight. But there I was, boarding the plane at 11:45 p.m., exhausted from a week-long business trip and eager to get home. If only I'd known that when I woke up, I'd find myself trapped in a nightmare at 35,000 feet, with no way out and no one to hear my screams. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of the flight that never landed. The plane was half empty, which wasn't surprising for such a late flight. I made my way down the aisle, my carry-on bag bumping against the seats as I searched for my row. 2-3A, a window seat. Perfect. I could lean against the wall and hopefully sleep through most of the 5-hour journey. As I settled in, I noticed the woman seated across the aisle. She was elderly, with wispy white hair and hands that trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. She caught my eye and gave me a warm smile. "First time flying?" she asked, her voice quavering but kind. I shook my head, returning her smile. "No, just ready to be home. Long week." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, dear, get some rest. Time flies when you're sleeping." If only I'd known how eerily prophetic those words would turn out to be. The usual pre-flight routine passed in a blur. I vaguely registered the flight attendants going through the safety demonstration, my eyes already heavy with exhaustion. As the plane took off, the gentle pressure pushing me back into my seat was oddly comforting. I was asleep before we even reached cruising altitude. I'm not sure what woke me up. Maybe it was the unusual silence, the absence of the constant hum of engines I'd grown accustomed to on flights. Or maybe it was the strange quality of the light filtering through my closed eyelids. Not the harsh fluorescence I expected, but something softer, more diffuse. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking away the fog of sleep. The first thing I noticed was that the window shade was up. I was sure I'd pulled it down before falling asleep. Outside, instead of the expected darkness or perhaps the first rays of dawn, I saw nothing. Just an endless expanse of swirling, pearlescent mist. Confused, I turned to ask the elderly woman if she knew what was going on. But the words died in my throat as I saw her seat empty. In fact, as I looked around the cabin, every seat was empty. The plane, which had been half full when we took off, was now completely deserted. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the silent cabin. "Is anyone there?" No response. Not even an echo. Heart pounding, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up. The plane seemed to stretch on forever, the rows of empty seats extending far beyond what should have been possible in a standard aircraft. I made my way to the front of the plane, expecting, hoping, to find a flight attendant or pilot who could explain what was happening. But the galley was empty, the cockpit door standing open to reveal nothing but more swirling mist where the instruments should have been. Panic began to set in as I realized the full extent of my situation. I was alone on a plane that seemed to be flying itself through some impossible void. I ran back down the aisle, no longer caring about being quiet. "Help!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Can anyone hear me? Please." As if in response to my cries, the plane shuddered. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something in the seat next to mine. A figure, indistinct and shadowy, there and gone in an instant. I froze, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Who's there?" I whispered, afraid to raise my voice again. No answer, but I could feel a presence now. Something watching me, its gaze almost tangible as it followed my every move. I stumbled back to my seat, collapsing into it as my legs gave out. As I sat there, trying to make sense of what was happening, I noticed something on the seatback screen in front of me. It was on, displaying the flight map. But instead of showing our progress across familiar continents, it showed an impossible landscape. Twisted spires and vast yawning chasms that hurt my eyes to look at. And there, at the bottom of the screen, was our estimated time of arrival, infinity. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. This couldn't be real. I must be dreaming. Any moment now, I'd wake up, and everything would be normal. But, as the minutes ticked by and reality refused to reassert itself, that hope began to fade. This was no dream. This was something far worse. I'm not sure how long I sat there, staring at that impossible flight map. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, but eventually, I became aware of a sound. Faint at first, but growing louder, whispers coming from all around me. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. And with each passing moment, the whispers seemed to be getting closer. That's when I noticed the mist outside had changed. It was no longer a formless void. Shapes were forming in it, vast, writhing things that defied description. And they were pressing against the windows, as if trying to get in. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. I leaped from my seat and ran down the aisle, no longer caring about the impossibly long cabin or the whispers that now seemed to be coming from inside my own head. I reached the emergency exit and, without thinking, yanked on the handle. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a whoosh of escaping air, the door opened. But instead of the rush of wind I expected, there was only stillness. The mist outside didn't move, didn't even seem to notice the open door. It just continued its slow, mesmerizing dance. And then, as I stood there, frozen in indecision, I felt it. A tug, gentle at first, but quickly growing stronger. The plane, the mist, the very fabric of this impossible reality. It was all being pulled towards something, and it was pulling me along with it. I grabbed onto the doorframe, my knuckles white with the effort of holding on, but it was useless. The pull was too strong, too insistent. With a cry of despair, I felt my grip loosen as I was yanked out of the plane and into the swirling void beyond. One thought blazed through my mind. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. I don't know how long I've been. Wherever this is, time has no meaning here. Sometimes I see other planes, other passengers trapped in their own private hells. We reach out to each other, but our hands pass right through, leaving us forever isolated. The landscape, if you can call it that, is ever-changing. One moment I'm falling through endless clouds. The next I'm walking through corridors that twist in ways that shouldn't be possible. And always, there's that pull, drawing me towards something I can't see, but can feel with every fiber of my being. I've tried to wake up, to tell myself this is just a dream. But deep down, I know the truth. This is real, more real than anything I've ever experienced. And I'm beginning to suspect that what I thought was reality, my life, my world, was the true illusion. Sometimes in quiet moments, I think I can hear the old woman's voice. Time flies, she says, her laughter echoing through the void. Time flies, and we fly with it. So if you're ever on a late-night flight, and you feel yourself drifting off to sleep, fight it. Stay awake, because you never know where you might wake up. And some journeys, once begun, can never truly end. Story 17. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils as I stepped into the hospital. It was supposed to be a routine checkup, nothing more. But as I sit here now, strapped to this gurney, surrounded by masked figures speaking in hushed tones, I realize that nothing about this day has been routine. And I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever leave this place alive. My name is David, and this is the story of how a simple medical procedure turned into a descent into madness and horror. It all started innocently enough. I'd been having some weird symptoms lately: headaches, dizzy spells, the occasional bout of forgetfulness. Nothing too alarming, but enough that my wife insisted I get checked out. So, there I was, bright and early on a Tuesday morning, ready for what I thought would be a quick in-and-out visit. The waiting room was nearly empty when I arrived. Just an elderly man dozing in the corner and a young mother trying to corral a fidgety toddler. I approached the reception desk, where a nurse with a too-wide smile greeted me. "Name," she chirped, her fingers poised over a keyboard. "David Mitchell," I replied, suppressing a yawn. I have an appointment with Dr. Reeves at 9:30. Her smile never wavered as she typed, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. It was almost like recognition, but that was impossible. I'd never been to this hospital before. Of course, Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Please take a seat. The doctor will be with you shortly. I settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair, absently flipping through an outdated magazine. The minutes ticked by, and I found myself growing increasingly anxious. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the silence broken only by the occasional cough or rustle of paper. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, a nurse called my name. She led me down a long corridor, our footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hallway was stretching, getting longer with each step. In here, please, the nurse said, gesturing to an examination room. Remove your clothes and put on the gown, doctor. Reeves will be in shortly. The paper gown crinkled as I sat on the examination table, the room's chill raising goosebumps on my skin. I waited, the tick of the wall clock impossibly loud in the quiet room. When the door finally opened, I was expecting Dr. Reeves, a kindly older man I'd spoken to on the phone. Instead, a young doctor I'd never seen before strode in, his face obscured by a surgical mask. Mr. Mitchell, he said, his voice muffled. I'm Dr. Saunders. I'll be handling your procedure today. I frowned, confusion and the first tendrils of fear creeping in. Procedure? I'm just here for a checkup. And where's Dr. Reeves? Dr. Saunders tilted his head, his eyes unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. Dr. Reeves is unavailable. As for the procedure, it's all here in your chart. You signed the consent forms, remember? But I didn't remember. I hadn't signed anything. Before I could protest further, the doctor was shining a penlight in my eyes, asking me to follow his finger. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting indeed. Nurse, prep the patient for transport. Wait, what? I tried to stand, but suddenly my limbs felt heavy, uncooperative. I don't understand. What's going on? But Dr. Saunders was already leaving, speaking rapid-fire medical jargon to a nurse I hadn't even noticed enter the room. As my vision began to blur, I felt hands guiding me onto a gurney. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was the ceiling tiles sliding by overhead, endless and hypnotic. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was in a different room, larger, dimly lit, filled with beeping machines. I tried to sit up, only to find my wrists and ankles restrained. He's awake, a voice said from somewhere to my left. Increase the dosage. No, I mumbled, my tongue feeling thick in my mouth. Please, I want to go home. A face swam into view above me. Dr. Saunders, still masked, his eyes now gleaming with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Home, he chuckled. Oh, Mr. Mitchell, you are home. You've always been home. As he spoke, other figures materialized from the shadows, all in surgical masks and gowns, all staring at me with that same unsettling intensity. What are you talking about? I managed to croak out. I don't live here. I have a wife, a job. Dr. Saunders shook his head, almost pityingly. Those are delusions, Mr. Mitchell. Constructs your mind, created to cope with the reality of your situation. But it's time to let them go now. It's time to remember who you really are. As he spoke, one of the other doctors wheeled over a large machine. Electrodes were attached to my temples, my chest, my arms. The beeping of the monitors grew louder, more insistent. Please, I begged. tears streaming down my face. "Please don't do this. I want to go home," single quotes. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. Dr. Saunders nodded to someone out of my line of sight, and suddenly my world exploded into pain. It felt like my skull was being split open, memories and images flooding my mind faster than I could process them. I saw myself in this same hospital, but younger, much younger. I saw experiments, treatments, faces both kind and cruel. I saw years passing in the blink of an eye, escaped attempts thwarted, hope dying a little more each day. And through it all, one phrase repeated over and over: "Remember who you are." When the pain finally subsided, I lay there gasping, my mind reeling from the onslaught of impossible memories. Dr. Saunders leaned over me, his eyes now visible as he'd removed his mask. They were my eyes, my face. "Do you understand now?" he asked softly. "Do you remember?" And God help me, I did. I remembered everything. The accident that had fractured my psyche. The years of treatment, of trying to piece myself back together. The periods of lucidity followed by deep dives into elaborate fantasy worlds my mind created to escape the truth. I'm not David Mitchell, am I? I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The doctor, the other me, shook his head. "No, you're patient 4721. You've been here for 20 years. David Mitchell was just the latest in a long line of personas you created. But it's time to let him go now. It's time to be whole again." As he spoke, the room around us began to shift and change. The harsh medical equipment melted away, replaced by softer lights and comfortable furnishings. A window appeared, showing a peaceful garden beyond. "This is your real room," my other self explained. "The life you thought you had, the wife, the job, all of it was a hallucination. A very vivid, very detailed hallucination, but not real. This is real. This is where you belong." I closed my eyes, feeling tears leak out from beneath my lids. Part of me wanted to scream, to rage against this impossible reality. But a deeper part, a part I'd been suppressing for so long, knew it was true. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now," my other self said gently, "we begin the process of reintegration. It won't be easy. There will be times when you'll want to retreat back into fantasy. But we'll be here to guide you, to help you stay grounded in reality." As he spoke, I felt the restraints being removed. I sat up slowly, looking around the room, my room with new eyes. It was familiar and alien all at once, like a childhood home revisited after decades away. "Take your time," my other self said, moving towards the door. "We'll be back to check on you soon. Remember, you're safe here. You're home." As the door closed behind him, I was left alone with my thoughts. With the weight of 20 years of false memories and a reality I was only beginning to understand. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with who and what I really am. But as I sit here, watching the sun set over a garden I'm seeing for the first time and the 1,000th time, I can't help but wonder how many other people are out there, living lives they think are real, unaware that they're trapped in a prison of their own minds making. And how many of them, if given the choice, would choose to wake up. Because the truth is, reality is a fragile thing. And sometimes, the greatest horror isn't what's out there in the world. It's what's hiding in the depths of our own minds, waiting to be remembered. Story 18. The old house loomed before me, its Victorian gables cutting stark silhouettes against the setting sun. I clutched the keys in my hand, their weight a reminder of the responsibility I'd taken on. It was just a simple house-sitting job, I told myself. 2 weeks looking after a stranger's home while they were away on business. Easy money for a broke college student. But as I stepped over the threshold, the door creaking shut behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked into something far more sinister than I'd bargained for. My name is Sam, and this is the story of how 2 weeks in a stranger's home nearly cost me my sanity and my life. The musty smell of old books and furniture polish hit me as soon as I entered. The foyer was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the ornate rug beneath my feet. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers brushing against cool, textured wallpaper before finding it. The chandelier above flickered to life, casting a warm glow that did little to dispel the house's gloomy atmosphere. Family photos lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow me as I made my way deeper into the house. "Hello," I called out, more out of habit than any real expectation of a response. My voice echoed back at me, swallowed up by the vastness of the place. I'd been briefed by the homeowners, the Blackwoods, before they left. A lovely couple in their 60s. They'd seemed almost too eager to have someone stay in their home while they were gone. "Just keep an eye on things," Mr. Blackwood had said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "And whatever you do, don't go into the attic. We're having some work done up there, and it's not safe." I'd nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. But now, standing in the silent house, that warning took on a more ominous tone. Shaking off my unease, I set about exploring my temporary home. The kitchen was a mix of modern appliances and antique fixtures, gleaming stainless steel alongside Victorian-era cabinets. In the living room, a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound tomes. As I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, I noticed something odd. Many of them seemed to be on occult subjects, demonology, ancient rituals, the history of witchcraft. Not exactly like bedtime reading. A noise from upstairs made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. It sounded like footsteps, but that was impossible. I was alone in the house. "Hello," I called again, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence was my only answer. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The upper floor was a long hallway lined with closed doors. Family photos covered the walls here too, but as I looked closer, I noticed something unsettling. In each photo, the faces had been scratched out, leaving blank ovals where smiles should have been. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of person would do that to their own family photos? I tried the nearest door. Locked. So was the next one, and the next. Only the last door at the end of the hall opened, revealing a cozy guest room. My room for the next 2 weeks. As I unpacked my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye, set my nerves on edge. But I was being ridiculous, right? Old houses made noises. It was perfectly normal. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable in the unfamiliar bed. The house seemed to come alive after dark, full of whispers and shuffling sounds that my rational mind insisted were just the wind or settling foundations. Just as I was finally drifting off, a loud thump from above jolted me awake. The attic. It had definitely come from the attic. I lay there, heart pounding, straining my ears. Another thump, followed by what sounded like dragging. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was out of bed, grabbing my phone for light as I crept into the hallway. The attic access was a trapdoor in the ceiling at the end of the hall. As I approached, I could hear more clearly now, definite movement above me. Something was up there. Mr. Blackwood's warning echoed in my mind. Don't go into the attic. But curiosity and fear warred within me. What if someone had broken in? Shouldn't I check? With shaking hands, I reached up and pulled on the cord. The trapdoor swung down, a ladder unfolding with it. Musty air wafted down, carrying with it a smell I couldn't quite place, something metallic and organic. I climbed the ladder slowly, my phone's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, creating looming shadows that seemed to move in the flickering light. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. A rustling sound to my left made me whirl around. There, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a figure, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly off in a way that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, it moved fast, inhumanly fast. One moment it was across the attic, the next it was right in front of me, its face inches from mine. I screamed, stumbling backward and losing my footing on the ladder. I fell, tumbling down into the hallway below. Pain shot through my body as I hit the floor, but adrenaline had me scrambling to my feet, slamming the attic door shut. I ran to my room, locking the door behind me and huddling on the bed, shaking uncontrollably. What had I just seen? It couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it was real, and I knew I was in danger. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. Every sound, every shadow had me flinching. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but too terrified to sleep. I needed answers. As soon as it was a reasonable hour, I called the Blackwoods. No answer. I left a message, trying to keep the panic out of my voice as I asked them to call me back as soon as possible. While I waited, I started digging. I scoured the internet for information about the house, about the Blackwoods. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had a dark history. Multiple disappearances over the years, always of young people who had been hired to watch the place, and the Blackwoods. They'd owned the house for over a century. Impossible, given their apparent age, unless a new noise cut through my spiraling thoughts. The sound of a key in the front door lock. Relief flooded through me. The Blackwoods must be back early. I could leave, get out of this nightmare. I rushed downstairs, words of explanation already forming on my lips. But the words died in my throat as I saw who had entered. It was the Blackwoods, but not as I'd last seen them. They were younger. Much younger, and their eyes were completely black, pupil-less voids that seemed to draw in all light. "Oh, Sam," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice a horrible parody of motherly concern. "You really shouldn't have gone into the attic. Now we'll have to start all over again." As they advanced on me, their forms shifting and changing into something inhuman, I realized the horrible truth. I wasn't the house sitter. I was the sacrifice. The last thing I remember is their hands reaching for me, cold as the grave and strong as steel. Then darkness. I don't know where I am now. Time has lost all meaning. Sometimes I think I'm still in that house, trapped in some hidden room or in the attic itself. Other times, I feel like I'm nowhere at all, lost in some in-between space. All I know is that I'm not alone. I can feel the presence of others. Past victims, perhaps, or other beings like what the Blackwoods had become. And always, I hear whispers. Promises of power, of knowledge beyond human understanding. All I have to do is give in, accept my fate. But I resist. I hold on to who I am, even as memories of my old life fade. Because I know that someday, someone else will come to that house. Someone else will be tricked, just like I was. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way to warn them before it's too late. So if you're ever offered a job that seems too good to be true, a chance to stay in a beautiful old house for easy money, think twice. Look closely at the owners, at the house itself. And if something feels off, trust your instincts and run. Because some houses are more than just buildings. Some are gateways to places we were never meant to go. And once you cross that threshold, there may be no coming back. Story 19. The first time I noticed something odd about my garden was when the roses started whispering. It was just after sunset. The sky a watercolor wash of purples and oranges. When I heard it, a soft, susurrating sound coming from my prized tea roses. I leaned in, thinking it must be the wind, only to jerk back in shock as I distinctly heard my name carried on the perfumed air. If only I'd known then that this was just the beginning, that my little hobby was about to bloom into a waking nightmare. My name is Eleanor, and this is the story of how my garden tried to consume me, quite literally. I'd always had a green thumb, but it wasn't until I retired that I really threw myself into gardening. My backyard became my canvas, a riot of colors and scents that was the envy of the neighborhood. I spent hours out there every day, tending to my plants with the care most people reserve for their children. The whispers started small, easy to dismiss as imagination or the wind playing tricks. But as the days wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. And it wasn't just the roses anymore. The daisies giggled, the sunflowers hummed, and the ivy. The ivy seemed to reach for me every time I passed. I told myself I was being silly. Plants don't talk. They certainly don't move on their own. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in my little Eden. It was about a week after the whispers started that I noticed the growth. My plants had always thrived under my care, but this was different. The rose bushes that had been neatly trimmed yesterday now towered over me, their thorns seeming sharper, more menacing. The sunflowers had doubled in size overnight, their cheerful faces now looking almost predatory as they tracked the sun's movement. "You're losing it, old girl," I muttered to myself, reaching for my pruning shears. But as I approached the overgrown rosebush, I could have sworn I saw it flinch away from me. I stood there, shears in hand, my heart pounding. This was crazy. Plants didn't move. They didn't feel. But as I watched, the roses slowly, impossibly, turned to face me, and then they spoke. "Eleanor," they whispered, their voices a chorus of rustling leaves and creaking stems. "We're so hungry, Eleanor. Won't you feed us?" I dropped the shears and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the day peeking out the windows, watching my garden with a mixture of fear and fascination. The plants seemed to have settled down, looking for all the world like normal, if overgrown, flora. That night, I dreamt of roots breaking through my floorboards, of vines wrapping round my limbs as I slept. I woke in a cold sweat, the pre-dawn light filtering through my curtains. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across my window, something large and leafy. But when I looked again, it was gone. I knew I should call someone. The police, a doctor, anyone who might believe me, but who would believe that my garden had come to life? They'd think I was senile at best, insane at worst. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went back out there. The morning sun did little to dispel the eerie atmosphere that now permeated my once cheerful garden. The air was thick with the cloying scent of two sweet flowers, and the buzz of insects seemed somehow ominous rather than soothing. "Hello," I called out, feeling ridiculous. Is anyone there?" The response was immediate. Every plant in the garden turned towards me, their leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze. And then they spoke, not in whispers this time, but in a cacophony of voices that made my head spin. "Eleanor, you've come back to us. We've missed you, Eleanor. Are you here to feed us, Eleanor?" I stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the assault on my senses. As I moved, I felt something brush against my ankle. I looked down to see a vine, one of my prized clematis, wrapping itself around my leg. "No," I cried, trying to shake it off. But it held fast, its grip surprisingly strong for something so delicate. More vines joined the first, creeping up my body with alarming speed. I tried to run, but roots burst from the ground, tripping me up. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping, the plants closed in. Flowers bloomed before my eyes, their petals unfurling to reveal moors lined with needle-sharp thorns. The sweet scent in the air turned cloying, suffocating. "Don't fight it, Eleanor," my roses crooned, their thorny stems caressing my cheek with terrifying gentleness. "We love you. We just want to be closer to you, to become one with you." I wanted to scream, to fight, but my limbs felt heavy, my mind foggy. Was it shock? Or was there something in that sickly sweet scent, some kind of natural sedative? As my consciousness began to fade, I saw my garden for what it truly was. Not the peaceful retreat I'd cultivated, but a living, hungry thing. Each plant was connected, part of a vast alien intelligence that had been lying dormant, waiting for what? The right conditions, the right caretaker. The last thing I remember before darkness took me was the feeling of being lifted, cradled in a nest of vines and leaves. And a voice, not one voice, but many, speaking as one. "Sleep now, Eleanor. When you wake, you'll be part of something beautiful, part of us." I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, everything had changed. I was still in my garden, but it was more, bigger, wilder. The neat beds and manicured lawns were gone, replaced by a jungle of impossible plants. Flowers the size of dinner plates bloomed on vines as thick as my arm. Trees with leaves of iridescent purple and blue towered overhead. And I was different too. I tried to move, only to realize I couldn't. Or rather, I could, but not in the way I was used to. I had no arms, no legs. Instead, I felt the sun on my leaves, the soil around my roots. I had become one of them. A plant, a conscious thinking plant, but a plant nonetheless. At first, I was terrified. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a rustle of leaves. I tried to run, but my roots held me fast. But as time passed, hours, days, it was hard to tell. I began to understand, to see the world as my garden saw it. The slow, patient growth, the deep connection to the earth and sky, the vast network of communication that ran through root and stem, connecting every plant in a symphony of chemical signals and electrical impulses. I felt the hunger that had driven them to consume me, but I also felt their love, their gratitude for the years of care I'd given them. In their own alien way, they had been trying to repay me, to elevate me to their level of existence. And I realized that I was no longer alone. Other voices joined mine in the garden's consciousness. My neighbors, lured in by the beauty of the ever-expanding flora. Passers-by who had stopped to admire a particularly stunning bloom, only to be embraced and absorbed. We were all here, all part of this new, growing awareness. Sometimes, in quiet moments when the sun has set and the nocturnal flowers are blooming, I wonder if this is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with a bloom. Will our garden keep growing, keep consuming, until the whole world is remade in shades of green and growing things? Part of me hopes so. The human part of me is horrified by this thought, but that part grows smaller every day, like a seed being absorbed by the soil. So if you ever pass by a garden that seems a little too perfect, a little too vibrant, be careful. Don't lean in too close to smell the roses. Don't reach out to touch that inviting vine, because you never know when a garden might reach back, and once it has you, it will never let you go. But oh, what a glorious thing it is to grow. Story 20.